Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads for our reattempt, I guess, at streaming this week. We had a little bit of internet issues yesterday, so we decided to postpone the stream to today. If you joined us live for the 30, 40 minutes, we were fighting through those issues yesterday. Hopefully, you are rejoining us today. If not, maybe you guys are catching the stream for the first time on a Wednesday and you're like, oh, I'd never seen them stream before on a Wednesday. Usually we are Tuesdays. So next week, if you want to join us, it will most likely be on a Tuesday. If not, we're going to enjoy the conversation tonight because there's a lot to discuss when it comes to Star Wars. Again, this week, this has been one of the biggest weeks of Star Wars news that we've had in at least 6 months, maybe even more, maybe even closer to Celebration last year, because things are real now with the Kathleen Kennedy departure. She has officially left Lucasfilm as the president and left it to Dave Filoni and Lynwen Brennan to be co-presidents running Lucasfilm. So we're going to talk about that. She gave a very extensive exit interview, and we are going to talk about all of the information we have learned from that interview. And it is truly some of the most behind the scenes information we've seen about Star Wars and what's going on over at Lucasfilm in years. I would say at least since that 2020 Investors Day announcement, because we have kind of been completely unaware of anything they're working on and what the state of things are that they've announced or has been leaked that they're working on. So we're going to talk about all of that as she gave kind of a final state of Star Wars as she left. We're going to talk about what that means for the future of so many of the movies you are aware of that have been announced, some you haven't been aware of, and some other things that are going on with TV on Star Wars, as well as some of the future of something like Indiana Jones. So we're going to talk about that. We also had some major news involving Disney parks this week with Star Wars. So Disney parks has had Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. It's been open in Disneyland since 2019, and I believe it opened shortly after in Disney World. It has been solely themed to the sequel trilogy. Well, this week they announced that they are changing that, and we are getting original trilogy theming to the main parts of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Rise of the Resistance is currently closed for refurbishment. What does all that mean? We're going to talk a little bit about what it means for Disney parks as we move closer to that 10th anniversary of Galaxy's Edge. We're going to talk about a failed Rick Famuyiwa led Star Wars series. Well, not necessarily failed, but in limbo currently. We're going to talk about that as well as so many other things tonight. So we have tons of news for you all, but of course, this is always a Q&A. So make sure you ask your questions. Any questions, comments, anything you have to say about these specific stories, we'll take in conjunction with our discussion on the topics. If not, if you have other questions, feel free to ask anything you want. We will be interspersing your questions in between our many news stories of the evening. So make sure you send in those questions. If you want to be featured in a video, we do take one fan question every week or so to highlight a video on the channel to be our fan question of the week. So if you want a chance to be fan question of the week, make sure you send that in. If you haven't hit the like button yet, it really does help out our channel. Make sure you hit the like and share this stream with other fellow Star Wars fans. If you're watching on replay, there is a hype feature on mobile you can hit that does boost our channel into the algorithm as well. And if you are new, finding us on replay or finding us live for the first time, subscribe. We do this every single week, like I said earlier, usually on Tuesdays when we don't have technical errors, but we can change it up, and we're going to do a Wednesday stream. We also have some news, too, regarding Maul Shadow Lord. The trailer is dropping tomorrow, so you can expect a trailer reaction from us. Let us know in the chat if you want to see a stream particularly about that. We talked about and have done some streams for other trailers that have dropped, like the recent Old Republic trailer that went up. We did one for Mandalorian and Grogu. So if you'd like to see a shorter stream, just specifically talking about Maul Shadow Lord, let us know in the chat. All right, let's get on to the news. And again, the biggest story of the week, even though we have been talking about it for nearly a year now, is the confirmed departure of Kathleen Kennedy. Almost a year ago, it broke that she was officially in the process of stepping down, officially in the process of finding her successor. And then about 6 months after that, nothing came from that. And at the end of the summer, we heard confirmation that it was going to be Dave Filoni and Lynwen Brennan who will be succeeding her. Then, about 2 weeks ago, it was reconfirmed that it was going to be happening soon. And then this past week, it happened. Kathleen Kennedy has stepped down from Lucasfilm. So, like I mentioned earlier, we have an extensive list of things that she left in her interview with Deadline that she gave, basically summarizing the state of what Lucasfilm is doing, reflecting on some of the things she has done as president of Lucasfilm, some of her failures, some of her successes, talking about some of her biggest regrets. And there was a lot of information out of that interview. So we're going to go through these 11 or so bullet points one by one. Yesterday we started to summarize them, but I think we just do quickly one by one tonight so you guys can chime in on each of these. And it's going to start with the fact that Starfighter is a film that was conceived as an original standalone story, but as we've said many times on the channel, Kathleen Kennedy did say they are open to potential sequels and that they have not yet had full discussions about it, but they are keeping the door open for Ryan Gosling and Sean Levy to return for future Star Wars Starfighter movies. We talked about this a little bit yesterday before our stream died, Senek, but reiterate your thoughts. What were your thoughts on the fact that basically what we've been talking about for almost a year since they started with or announced Starfighter, that this movie is a standalone concept, but absolutely will get sequels if it's successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, Star Wars is a franchise that has been multi-generational. It is America's modern myth. It has been something that has been a merchandising powerhouse ever since all these studios passed over on it and Fox gave up rights to Lucas because they thought, whatever, some random silly space fantasy science fiction film, right? And, we're still talking about it today for a good reason, right? And it is a central cog in what Disney wants to do with continuing these IP-led storytelling into the future, even if we're not necessarily in that 2010s, late 2000s peak of like, "Oh my god, like, we're really taking these big cinematic stabs at it." Now, that's old news, like, how do you continue and how do you advance and how do you keep the quality up and at the same time spread into new areas and directions for these franchises that have had their own designated ways of going towards their storytelling. And I think the one thing that I really wanted to make a point of yesterday, which kept on getting cut out, unfortunately, was that as much as there's all this planning, all these false starts, all this and that. One thing I don't think Lucasfilm fully expected was to see Grogu become this big of a character. Like, this was not supposed to be a show that expanded into being the centerpiece of Star Wars post sequels. Arguably, it even with a little bit more of turbulence around the Manoverse post season two, with the spin-off shows like Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and Skeleton Crew, and then the return in season three that was definitely upended by Book of Boba Fett and the split of Filoni and Favreau to their own 2 TV shows. Still, the merchandising that comes off of Grogu, like the attention that that little image of a baby Yoda brings into people's mind, like kids have grown up with Grogu at the end of the day. Grogu hasn't necessarily picked up the pace with them, but he has been growing as well, slowly but surely. And that is the one thing that I think Star Wars is trying to get into. And it's one thing that Marvel succeeded at. You could see these characters grow through time. They're not necessarily like youngsters. Marvel hasn't succeeded in that area. They've made some stabs at TV recently, especially in more their repairs to their TV format. What we see with like Acta all along, that little WandaVision trilogy that's shaping up to conclude with the Vision show to come out. But for the most part, all their kind of young upstarts have failed. But their movies and their better shows have shown massive character arcs, have kept them going in a linear fashion for 10, 15 years. And, full credit to them. Despite the ups and downs, people are still excited to see a lot of these characters, excited to see how they've grown and changed over time. And that's what Lucasfilm is trying to do. I think they wanted to do that with the sequels, but again, Iger didn't really give Kathleen, did not give JJ or anybody time to really have between the films. 2 years was mandated, right? And I know I'm seeing a lot of comments saying like, "Oh, I'm glad Kathleen's gone." We'll get to that point later, but sequel trilogy wasn't planned. Some of it was organic filmmaking, like Ryan Johnson said, like building off of each other. Sure, but there's also just no like structural time for that to like naturally happen in a way that we saw with the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, despite also being relatively unplanned structurally. So for the Mandalorian to have spawned into this big surprise, big show for them as a centerpiece of as a flagship show for the Disney Plus launch when streaming had just exploded in 2019, right as the final film was coming out of the sequel trilogy, to have that reputation still going strong, that kids are like excited and want to see Grogu grow up and change. Yeah, I mean, it's become this weird thing where it's like you can't ignore how big it is, but streaming has unfortunately died in the last 2, 3 years. Nobody can just live off of subscribers anymore, right? Nobody can just say, "Oh, I added another million this quarter, therefore I can put another 3 spin-off shows." The bubble has burst. We're getting TV shows that are gonna be made more old-fashioned with lower budgets. And yet we have this enigma of Grogu and Din Djarin being so big of characters that they've jumped into the cinematic verse, right? There's a chance that we might get a season 4 off of this, chance we might get movie spin-offs off of this. But at the end of the day, this is a character that you've seen grow up, and kids and teenagers and adults want to follow through on that. But Grogu is a puppet. At the end of the day, like as lifelike as Grogu is, it's from Disney Imagineering. It's no different than the BD droids that we're seeing, the Anselons and all that. It's just a little bit more technology, a little bit more liveliness, a little bit more interaction with these human actors, right? When we hear about Flynn Gray and Starfighter, a relative unknown, there has been some actors. I think there was that Netflix miniseries that came out in 2025. The kid Owen from that was in the running for this film apparently, but this is a kid that they're like, oh yeah, like he's getting film school with all these big actors like Ryan Gosling, with Mia Goth, and the actor who's playing the new Green Lantern. I mean, it's just gonna be a big training arena for this kid, but it's not just gonna be one and done if it's successful, right? The question of it being a Starfighter 2 sequel, I don't know. That's not a guarantee, but I think that this kid, with how Kathleen's been vouching for him, how he's been responding on set, they wanna have a kid grow into this franchise, a kid that we follow for 10, 15 years. Marvel's closest thing to that has been Tom Holland, right? We've seen the Tom Holland high school trilogy, right? We've never seen that with the Sam Raimi films and Tobey Maguire. We barely got that with Andrew Garfield for like a film in like 10 minutes of the second. Now we had this sick kid go through all of high school, and we're about to maybe even see like a college trilogy out of Tom Holland. And that's still a huge, huge sell for Marvel. And in the same way, I think that's what they want out of this kid. The more we hear about Starfighter, it's like, is it about like a bunch of factions in the galaxy and pilots? Well, no, now apparently Tom Cruise is on set directing lightsaber duels and all that. Apparently, maybe this kid is related to or is himself force sensitive, right? There's like layers that are being built up that if this film is decently successful, no matter what, I think this character continues. But I think the hope is you get Starfighter 2 to continue in its own path, maybe build out kind of how the Mandoverse has been in TV with like a spin-off universe of a post-sequel trilogy, and then you allow yourself to jump in with these sequel characters that can cameo like Ray, like Finn, and all that, and then grow into a little bit more actualized and well-written characters, and not have to carry the full burden as the sequel trilogy had them do when it was a lot more uneven. So definitely, definitely excited for this kid. I think it'll be a really exciting thing to follow. I'm not 100% sold we're getting a Starfighter 2 sequel. I think we might get whatever's happening with Hunt for Ben Solo, Rey's New Jedi Order, the connections to the Kinberg trilogy, and maybe even some other TV shows that are in development that we don't know about. Maybe that's where this kid will have a chance to like jump in between and develop. But if you're starting him off in movies, I figure you're going to keep him in movies at least for one more before you kind of play between the two mediums. And Starfighter 2 is at least the safest transition for an audience to just continue and follow without having any specific connections to the sequels that you need to know, any specific connections to the greater Star Wars timeline. So I'm excited for this kid, and I like that, this is a movie that is definitely more like episode 1-esque where you have all these big star actors and you don't have to put all the pressure on the younger kids like you did in the original trilogy, like you did in the sequel trilogy. But it's not like they're not planning for this kid to eventually have to become like almost like the Tom Holland Spider-Man, like to bear the weight of this universe. And I see no way where you don't have a Grogu and this kid interact at some point if he becomes successful.
I think this is a smart move if they are starting to build their post Rise of Skywalker not purely on the backs of a 10, 11, 12, but on an amalgamation of characters, and in that way, it is MCU-esque, an amalgamation of characters who you know and hopefully like from multiple different properties that are around this same thing. We'll talk about Kinberg in a little bit because if that is 10, 11, and 12, it sounds like it's getting fast-tracked. They are trying to get that out, but that's kind of been my thought this whole time since especially they started hyping up Starfighter. It really feels like they're trying to build different pieces around a larger whole that will ultimately have a 10, 11, and 12. But in the same way that originally the Rey film was given the namesake of New Jedi Order, I think that's kind of their basis for the way they want to build this out, where New Jedi Order has its main hardcovers, and that has a lot of the heartbeat and the main story in it, but it has a lot of the paperback only releases that had the other characters that a bunch of other authors had written. Like you have the Dark Tide duology with Stackpole that focuses on Cornhorn. You have Greg Key's duology that focuses on Anakin Solo. You have a bunch of different stories that focus on different characters who had been in the EU at the time, but weren't necessarily the focus like Luke, Han, and Leia were. And so I think they're trying to do something in that same way. And it's not exclusive to New Jedi Order. It's not exclusive to the MCU. It's just what big storytelling, big arc storytelling, which is something that a lot of Star Wars creators have alluded to. Dave Filoni, especially, talking about timelines and stuff like that, that he has been working with the way they're trying to craft an entire timeline around Star Wars. It seems their focus is on the bigger picture, and I think that's smart because when you deal with trilogies, whether people like them or not, when they're over, right? Where do you go from that? How do you tell stories that are bigger or more important or just as interesting or just as exciting as a 10, 11, 12? Well, you do it with kind of that MCU Avengers as structure. 10, 11, 12 maybe come out every 4 years, not every other year or every 3 years like they were before with the prequel and original trilogies. They come out with a bunch of other movies like a Starfighter, or if Ray's movie happens, or another type of movie that might have new characters we don't know, that fits in and fleshes out and expands the world. And then those movies focus on the plot, right? That's what the MCU did so well at its peak, was flesh the world out through properties that weren't as exciting or weren't as epic, but told character centric stories, told stories that focused on the people who lived in this universe, focused on the little moments in the universe. And then Avengers were Thanos, were Ultron, were Loki. Those were the types of things you waited in those epic movies for. And I think that's, to me, their approach. That's what they're going to go for. I mean, we it's easier said than done, obviously, because the Avengers, the MCU has been a flashpoint so far. It's been the only thing we've seen of its kind that's actually worked. We've seen so many cinematic universes start and fail, and it's most likely that there will be some stinkers in whatever they're working on next if they are doing that. But if your quality can outweigh the few in your quantity that aren't good, then I think this could work like any other cinematic universe could work. And I think it provides. I know we got a question yesterday, I believe, from Brandon. It was like, what is the core of Star Wars moving forward? Or maybe it was Critical Thinker. I think it was Critical Thinker. What's the core of Star Wars moving forward? We don't know. I've always argued that it should be New Republic and recast your original trilogy characters because that is the heart and soul of Star Wars are the original trilogy characters. But if you're able to craft a universe that's multi-layered, that has multiple different pieces of storytelling, that has multiple different subgroups of characters that people love, if you're able to create something that's that rich, it doesn't really matter what era you create it in, as long as you're able to help get people to fall in love with your characters, right? If Starfighter's the first step on that direction, then I think it's a smart one to try and go that direction. I mean, that would be something new for Star Wars. People keep talking about, and even in this chat, we have people like Deadlocked who's saying they're getting tired of the Imperial era. That's the way Star Wars and books has really been able to differentiate itself, and that's the way other franchises have been able to differentiate themselves from the other fare of their same genre. It's the reason the MCU stands alone amongst its genre because it was able to do something and create such a rich world that people were invested in no matter who the characters were. And I think that's something worth trying with Star Wars. Could it fall flat on its face? Could it last like 5 years and die like something like the DCEU or even worse, the monster universe, the dark universe that we've seen so many come and go? But if it succeeds, it could be something they have going for 20 years and it could just keep building on itself. And a character like this boy in Starfighter, what's his name? Flynn Gray. He
Yeah, Flynn Gray.
can be the architect of that. He can be one of the central pieces. And I can't help but see the similarities. And this is not to get some people riled up, but I can't help but see the similarities to the original Lucas outlines for the sequels by doing that. Having teenage kids, having late tens, early like tween age kids running this universe, maybe being in the background at first, and then taking over from a Ryan Gosling later on the line. I can't help but see the similarities in what was originally pitched that they decided not to go with. And maybe they are bringing those things back now because they were there the whole time. And they decided instead of telling something a little bit more long form like that, they wanted to go with something that was a little bit more sure. And so we'll see. We'll see how it works. I prefer them taking that type of risk than just saying, hey, let's do 10, 11, and 12. And guess what? There's a fourth version of the Empire back, and now we have to fight it again. If there's going to be stuff like that, I'd rather have a world to live in with that type of storytelling. Let's move on to the second point because this is a big one, and we get questions about this one all the time, and that is Dawn of the Jedi. So, Dawn of the Jedi, as many of you know, was going to be directed by James Mangold. Well, we have an update from Kathleen Kennedy herself on that project. And in summary, it's on the back burner and may not happen at all. The direct quote from her is, I have to tread a bit carefully here because James Mangold and Beau Willimon wrote an incredible script, but is definitely breaking the mold and it's on hold. And then this is also in regards to some of the other scripts that are out there. She has talked about specifically Taika Waititi's movie. And she said about Taika's script, he has turned in a script that is hilarious and great. It's not just my decision, especially when I've got a foot out the door. Donald Glover has also turned in a script. And as you've read, Steven Soderbergh and Adam Driver have turned in a script written by Scott Burns. It was great. Anything's possible if somebody else is willing to take the risk. Then, in regards to the other movies, she says Mangold's movie is really on the back burner, as is Steven Soderbergh's Kylo Ren movie. I think the ones by Taika and Donald are still somewhat alive. That's going to be really up to the new team to figure out. Up to Dave. I know that Dave and Lynwen are very much on board with what Simon Kinberg is doing and that would be a new trilogy in the timeline of things that takes you well into 2030 plus. So that's really what's up next. So when we have to look to the future of Star Wars, we have all these projects out there. We have Dawn of the Jedi, we have Lando, we have The Hunt for Ben Solo, and we have Simon Kinberg. It does sound like Simon Kinberg is what's next. And like I was just making the point previously, if that is 10, 11, 12, if they decide to bill it as 10, 11, 12, but even if they don't, and it's still kind of that main post Rise of Skywalker Skywalker saga type story, then it sounds like all of their focus currently is on post Rise. And that's why something like Dawn of the Jedi is on the back burner because it would take place in just a completely different part of the Star Wars universe that really wouldn't have anything to do with what they're working on. Sounds like that's why a Lando is on the back burner, even though Lando, I think, would be a much safer thing to just randomly release in between because people will know who it is and people already have interest in the Solo, a Star Wars story and seeing that continue. Taika Waititi's thing, we don't get any new information here about what it is. She's called it hilarious, which means it is leaning towards comedy, which has been something that a lot of people have been concerned about, specifically with Taika writing a movie. I think you can have hilarious Star Wars movies that still take themselves seriously. But some of Taika's movies more recently, I haven't personally been as big of a fan of, whether it be Thor: Love and Thunder or his, I think it was called Next Goal Wins, his soccer movie. It was okay, but nothing super memorable. It kind of got bogged down in the most basic forms of his humor, where we've seen something like Jojo Rabbit, where he can take his humor and also give you that dramatic heft. It'll be interesting to see which side his script was on. But I think the big thing here is just knowing that the projects we've had officially announced, like Dawn of the Jedi, as well as the projects that have been kind of in this limbo state, they're still all in limbo. And I think the other interesting thing there is that she didn't once mention the Rey New Jedi Order Charmin Obeyed Chinoy movie at all, which we know has a third, fourth writer on it. We know they're supposedly still working on it. We know Daisy Ridley has been hyping up Star Wars in general recently. I feel like all of this is to lead to the fact that she is going to be in Starfighter. She's going to be in Simon Kinberg's movie, but I don't know if this Rey movie's happening. And if it is happening, I don't think it's happening anytime soon.
Yeah, a lot of interesting projects that are a lot more formulated than I was expecting to hear about. Me personally, I would be most excited in the Lando project. I think just the reputation of Donald Glover as a writer definitely supersedes even some of his acting and music and all that. He is a renaissance man in all senses. I know he had some health issues. He had a stroke recently, so he's only gotten very close to or just started performing again. So I he's a guy that, for like 12, 13 years you'd be hearing about him doing like two big projects a year, and then last year was, like, the first time in a while I was like, "Oh, it's kinda quiet, like, what's going on there?" He released an album, and then that was it, and it's because he had a stroke, so yeah, I mean, I think writing is probably a little bit better for him than being a performer per se. Obviously, this being a Lando series turned, film, we heard about that showrunner discussing like how nothing was really going, and then he's kind of out of it. And then we heard rumors that Donald had taken over because they're making this into a film with him and his brother Stephen Glover, who they write everything together. So yeah, I'm pretty excited for that because I've seen Atlanta. I have seen parts of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I've seen some of just like the short films that he's done and all. He just has these sensibilities that I think really are different, but can fit into Star Wars. Like we know enough about Han Solo as a character, and a big criticism about Solo as a movie is that it's just you get to see like every little facet of that character kind of slapped together. Some things work better, like how you see his gun deconstructed and handed over to him. That seemed to work really well for a lot of people. Then you see the infamous like, "Oh, you don't have a last name? Guess we'll go with Han Solo." And it's like, "Oh, okay." Like I'd rather that have been self-created as a kid instead of an Imperial telling me this, right? Like those are things that you would just hear in the discourse around the film, and the fact that it just didn't get to continue, the fact that it came 6 months after the controversy around Last Jedi and, like, just how polarized the fandom had been at that time, the lack of marketing and even the marketing that came out, just the mixed messaging and signals around the, film in general because you fire your original directors who had been on a pretty big hot streak with the Lego Movie and all that and suddenly are gone, and then Kasdan and what he was voicing. it was unfortunately gonna be a film that suffered, and it did, and it effectively ended a Star Wars story as a thing. You know, we've had TV shows kinda taking that place, and yeah, I mean, I wanna see what they do with a film. It's been a while since we've seen, like, Glover really be attached to something of this magnitude. I don't think he's ever written something for film that he would star in. He's only really done TV series, so I'd love to see what difference it is, if this is something that he's been working on since he got casted, or just something that he's, like, piecing together and revamping from the original series pitch. I hope it happens. I wanna have this be, like, a nice little continuation there, but I would also want it to be its own thing. Like you said, just let us see Lando in a different light. Let him be a little differentiated from what we've seen in the real original trilogy and build off some of the interesting things that Glover was performing, but didn't necessarily have a script to really explore fully. So, yeah, I'm excited for that. I want that to happen, and I think the potential having Billy D kinda do his own version of recording those hollow stories that, we saw Donald Glover get to do in Solo Star Wars Story. That would be very cool. That'd be a nice, like, final send off for him in the franchise, and I think it's one that everybody would be able to love. Like, this is a way of, like, telling maybe a story that you don't have to necessarily believe all of it because it's Lando. He always exaggerates, he always puts a little panache on it and all, but if you get to see Billy D say that and then you transform his storytelling and directly into seeing Don Glover performing as a character and going through this story would be awesome. I don't need it to be Crimson Dawn related. I don't necessarily even need Alden back for it, but I would love it to be almost like a spiritual sequence in some sense. So excited for that. Not so hot on the Taika film. I think we've gone to this point now that it's like everybody's bashing on him, unfortunately. He still made like The Hunt for the Wilder People. He still made Thor Ragnarok. Like he still did some great films. It's just that, he kind of got lost in the sauce. He got lost in his own formula and doubled down on his Taika Waititi isms. And once you build a reputation in Hollywood, it's really hard to get out of it. He got pigeonholed, and frankly, even in his best films, I think he was kind of just sticking to that formula. That's what I saw, even like with Jojo Rabbit. I think that was already when you started seeing a little bit of that criticism really come together. Like, oh, good stuff here, but like, sometimes he's undercutting himself. Sometimes there are moments that I just wish that he'd let linger a little bit more. And me personally, having gone to see The Hunt for the Wilder People and seeing just how his tone had such balance before, the original version in the clips that I've seen of What We Do in the Shadows and how he also transformed the TV show once he kind of came back to it and added a little bit more of his gravitas. And that is a bit later after Ragnarok and Closer to Love and Thunder, right? It He still has the capability. I don't think that just disappears, but yeah, maybe they're just waiting for him to like make something of his own before he comes back into a big franchise like Star Wars, and then everybody's like, "Oh, we'll give him a chance." Now, right now, he's still dealing with Love and Thunder just because the MCU hasn't necessarily taken a huge step away from films like that in Phase 4 and Phase 5. We have to see what Doomsday happens to be like. We have to see what Brand New Day looks like. If we have a little streak here from Thunderbolts onwards, right, and you can even add Daredevil in there, then maybe Taika and all these other directors who have had a little bit of a damper reputation, get another chance. I mean, we're seeing, unfortunately, not in the box office per se, but we are seeing Nia DaCosta. She directed the new 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, and it's got better ratings than the last one. It's got a great cinema score and everything. So for her, it's like suddenly people are looking at it as like, oh, it wasn't necessarily the material, it wasn't necessarily her direction, or it's more just the Marvel brand and what she was kind of dealt with in the Marvels that really wasn't beneficial to showing off her range as a director. So we've seen already some of that like repaired reputation already happen with a Marvel director. I think Taika just needs that opportunity first before whoever is in charge of making the decision, whether it be Lynwen, whether it be Dave or both, right? Really goes forward with that. But yeah, I'm still surprised that we have like a full script submitted. The way that we're talking about this, it kind of felt more nebulous, like how we've seen with Rogue Squadron, which I think is also a key thing to bring up. We didn't hear anything directly from Kathleen about any sort of draft submitted. We've heard Patty Jenkins say stuff like that. We've heard some trade information about that, some rumors, but Rogue Squadron not being put in this, I thought was very, very pointed. So I think that's not even back burner. I think it's just gonna be integrated into other pieces of media, maybe books, comics, whatever it is. It's just not set for a movie, especially in a post Top Gun Maverick world where you've already seen that be executed so well. And frankly, I don't think Jenkins has the visual flair of a Kaczynski to be able to match something like that with the expectations now for dogfighting and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, all in all, very informative from Kathleen. Excited for what I'm hearing. I do want Dawn of the Jedi to still happen. I don't think Mangold has that issue as others do. Like he very quickly moved on from a muted reception to what we saw from Dial of Destiny with Indiana Jones. But this is a guy who's a little bit more a tourist. He's someone who has really picked films that he's absolutely like delivered on, and maybe he's just like, I like what put here. I don't know if you guys are ready for that with all this management changes and all that. Maybe let's come back to it later. But it being connected to Ahsoka, it being connected to Dave Filoni's New Republic film, which is now also on the back burner, right? Like at some point, those things were all connected in their own sort of plan. It's kind of the odd man out, but I don't think we fully abandoned it. I just think we're figuring out the New Republic timeline, the post sequel timeline, getting those things started before opening up a whole new world like that.
Yeah, I would imagine that that one is the most nebulous in terms of they can release it whenever because it's so disconnected from everything else they seem to be focusing on, whether in TV or in film, that it's just like when do they think maybe the Star Wars brand is healthy enough to release something that's so disassociated with what people know of Star Wars to where that can still succeed, right? I would imagine that's more of the issue than anything is like the Star Wars brand outside of being in rough shape right now has not had a film come out in 7 years. They are trying to build goodwill up not just for the franchise but in theaters again and see what does a Star Wars movie make in 2026 because we know it could have every movie outside of Solo that she made was $1 billion prior to COVID. What does a Star Wars movie make post COVID? Especially now that we've trained audiences to expect Star Wars on TV. I think that's more of their concern, especially because Dawn of the Jedi, if it's anything like the comics or the book, is so, so different from anything else you've seen in Star Wars that it almost is indistinguishable. And I think I don't imagine the film will be really anything like the book or the comics, but if it is that kind of like complete transformation of the mythology, complete originization of everything we've seen from the Jedi to the Force to all that, it's gonna be something they're gonna have to convince people to watch through great marketing. And so I think that specifically is probably their concern. But Mangold does have that movie he's working on with Timothy Chalamet right now, and then he also has Swamp Thing, which we don't know what's coming from that he's tied on board to do as well. So he has multiple projects, and it seems like Swamp Thing and Dawn of the Jedi are his like, if you want me to do it, I'll do it, but I'm gonna work on a bunch of other things until you give me the say so. So we'll see what comes from that. But yeah, that's the one I want to see the most, and I think that's the one that's could probably be the most easily just dropped into the release calendar out of nowhere because it doesn't have to connect to really anything else they're working on. I think Lando's the other one that's more likely to happen, just with the goodwill behind Solo over the last 10 years, with the positivity around the depiction of Lando specifically from Donald Glover, with Maul Shadow Lord coming out and kind of a return to the dark times and these characters with Crimson Dawn, and if Dryden Voss or any of the other characters that are involved in Crimson Dawn and that Solo story have any type of significant role in Maul Shadow Lord, you could see a little bit of resurgence for that time period. So I think that's the one that's second most likely. I really don't think Taika Waititi's movie is going to happen. I think, like you said, he kind of needs to rediscover himself maybe at this point. I mean, we don't know when he wrote that script, right? She said he turned one in. They announced him for Star Wars like in 2018 or something like that. It's been forever. So they it could have been 6 years ago he turned in a script. Like, he might not have any interest really in doing that movie anymore. So we'll see. But yeah, he has made some incredible movies in his first 10 years, whereas, as hot as anybody's first 10 years with Boyd to What We Do in the Shadows, to Hunt for the Wilder People. All of that stuff is absolutely fantastic, and to culminate it with Thor Ragnarok and then Jojo Rabbit. I mean, I think he had a nice 5, 6 movie stretch. Uh, so I think he's taken some time off. It's been 3 years since he's made a movie. I think he's kind of rediscovering a little bit more traditional Taika Waititi roots for his movies, and we'll see where that goes. But yeah, it's interesting because his movie was always rumored to be Dawn of the Jedi before they announced James Mangold's. So it's interesting to see what his movie actually might have been in conjunction with that. Let's take some of your guys' questions here, and then we'll move on to the TV side of that interview, because she does talk about TV and what is coming from Star Wars TV, or what at least she's tried to get going with Star Wars TV. Let's see. Scrolling through the chat, we have Deadlock, who says, I'm so excited from Shadow Lord, just sub to you. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Coltrane, who says, so apparently Kylo Ren is a vintage car collector now. And then Deadlock also says, get Kathleen out of here. Ionata says, and Dave Filoni, I trust. And then Coltrane says, Kathleen Kennedy says, I was advised to take chances. Also, Kathleen Kennedy, here's all these projects I didn't want to take chances on. Yeah, well, we don't fully know the backstory, but it does seem like they have been hesitant to pull the trigger on almost anything with the Star Wars brand, really kind of on shaky ground. And I would imagine that's kind of probably a top-down mandate, but also just the reality of living in a post-COVID world. And I think in some ways, I don't necessarily think this is the right mindset, but in some ways, they're probably trying to not damage the brand any further than it has been damaged over the last 6, 7 years, with continued mediocrity and the odd hits not really making up for that overall mediocrity that we have seen. So I would imagine that's more of their plan has been, just we got to get it right when we do put something out. But yeah, it is kind of crazy even hearing her acknowledge all of the things that have been announced or have been worked on, and that we haven't seen like any of them, like the way she's talked about them. It's like they're still, we've worked on all these dozen things that you guys know about, but have never actually come out. And that's what I think is even crazier, because I would have expected an exit interview to focus more on the stuff that has been within the last couple years, but not to go all the way back to like Taika Waititi and those types of projects that are kind of like, the back burner jokes of the Star Wars production timeline, because they just seem like, oh yeah, we'll get Taika Waititi's movie one day, just the same time we get Ryan Johnson's trilogy, right? So it is interesting to hear her bringing a little bit of credence to stuff like the Taika movie, and actually saying in the interview that it's closer than the James Mangold movie, which is more of a shock to me.
Yeah, yeah, that is a statement that I personally don't love hearing, because I want to see what Mangold cooked up. I'm someone who still likes Dial of Destiny quite a bit. I think he did a pretty good job with the Spielbergisms and both the action, the MacGuffins, and everything. But I can also admit when it's just not everybody's cup of tea, 100%. But for the most part, it's not like this guy hasn't dealt with franchises before, right? He did Logan. It's a very similar story to, like, some X-Men runs around Wolverine and X-23, but it's still a pretty drastic step away from what everybody had expected out of Fox X-Men at that point, which, mind you, I mean, we still haven't necessarily gotten past Fox X-Men. Even Deadpool 3 is more of a Fox goodbye than it is like a, "Here is how we're reinventing X-Men." It seems like we might start getting a little bit more of that in Spider-Man with some of the rumors there and, Doomsday, but Logan was what really put him on the map, and it is a pretty bold swing. I think the biggest criticism people have generally had is more about like the physical villain of the story. It is a little bit like on the nose. It is a little bit undercooked at points, especially as we get closer to the end of the story. And that's fair to say. I think that was one of the things that even now watching back at it, I'm like, I don't think that was necessarily thought too deeply about, and it could have been something that took the film to another level if they really had real story elements for it, as opposed to just dressage for a little bit more of like the mental trauma and the relationship between, adopted father and daughter and just the falling apart of Wolverine and the remaining X-Men, right? So yeah, I mean, I think Logan still stands the test of time for a reason because I think he hits the nail on most of those things. So I think he would have done something pretty well here with Dawn of the Jedi. But like we were saying, both of us, it's just maybe not something that this current state of Star Wars until it takes some very confident swings for both the New Republic and post sequel era that we can really say like we're ready to do that. Like I know someone has put in the chat like they want to see. I think it's deadlocked. It's like, yeah, you're tired of Imperial era and need more Old Republic stuff. I mean, we are gonna get the fate of the Old Republic video game at one point. We don't know yet, right? The game director who was on KOTOR 1 and 2 in Mass Effect, or just KOTOR 1 and Mass Effect, did mention like, yeah, it's a new studio, but it'll be there before 2030. That's the plan. So that seems like so far away, but we're in 2026, guys. That's we're getting old, a little older day by day. That's not too far away now, but yeah, I mean, we'll start to get stuff like that. At one point, it seemed like Eclipse was happening with High Republic connections. Supposedly, that's still in the works, right? Like, we don't really know what era we're jumping into, but I think this idea of jumping into more than two plus eras is maybe off the table until we get movies really flowing again. Once we get movies flowing again, and you can get these sort of sub franchises happening, then I think we can take a big swing like that again. I'm not saying again, I wanna see that personally. As someone like Liam has been a fanatic my whole life, that's not gonna be something that's too much of a challenge, and I think Star Wars fans in general are much better at dealing with different timelines, different characters, even if we do have a lot of stories about people's parents being confused about Rogue One being a sequel to The Force Awakens and stuff like that from back in the day, but yeah, I think Dawn of the Jedi is just visually and conceptually would have been just so far removed. The way that, like, it's even hinted at, it seems like it would have been even earlier than Dawn of the Jedi in the EU, so we probably don't even have, like, swords, we don't probably have YOTOR and stuff like that that Legends fans could hook onto. It might just be, like, a totally clean slate, and that might be, like, a little too strange for people, right? And it's like, what is there about Star Wars other than literally discovering the Force, right? So, I can understand that. I think Taika's film from the nothing that we have seems like it would fit into one of the eras that is been actively worked on still or has had something within Disney's timeline of owning the Star Wars brand and putting out stories for it. So it makes sense to me. But I do also want to tie in Battleside's thoughts about Ben Solo project. I know in that same interview she did mention Hunt for Ben Solo, and I know what you're saying here, Coltrane, like advice to take chances by Bob Iger, but here's all the projects I didn't want to take chances on. Like Liam said, a lot of this does seem top down. We do know for a fact that from all the people involved in Hunt from Ben Solo, this is an idea that Soderbergh pitched. Adam Driver's working on hand in hand with him, and the fact that it was truly greenlit, right? The first ever project greenlit by Lucasfilm that was struck down by Bergman, by Iger. I think that's what has to like really be like almost like a flashpoint for how people look at Kennedy. Because this is something that we saw the huge swell of support for. We still do here, like the Hunt for Ben Solo hashtags, little butterflies that are always kind of floating around on social media. This is something that people want, and I don't think even Lucasfilm was 100% prepared for someone of an auteurist level as Soderbergh coming in with Adam Driver, with how big his career has been since Star Wars. So that probably also changed some of their plans, but despite all of that, they were ready. They were ready to go with this and work around it and believed in it and top down, got struck down there. So I think it's fair to say, Kathleen has been maybe hesitant on some properties, hesitant on pulling the trigger on certain things. Absolutely true. We can't deny that with the type of projects that she's discussing in such detail and the number of it. But I think we can also point out that a lot of it is from Iger and some of the issues that have popped up there. We've also heard a little bit of Iger and what he's done with Feige and MCU. So it is starting to feel less like how the popular opinion was like 4 or 5 years ago. Is like Kathleen's pushing down Star Wars, isn't letting Star Wars explode and grow. And it's more like it is a fight between these big franchises and Iger and what he feels is right for Disney and all of its IPs moving forward. And I think Iger still has done a good job, but stuff like this definitely makes me personally feel like, okay, it's fine for Kathleen to go because now there isn't that like 10, 12 year back and forth. Let's see what he's got with Filoni and Lynwen when there's two people that he's got to juggle between who now have been trained in the Lucasfilm and the Lucas Arts quite literally, right? From a story perspective, who have been with ILM even before this purchase from 1999 in case of Lynwen, who can give a perspective that maybe someone who came from the producing angle like Kathleen wouldn't necessarily have, right? And now Iger has to maybe weight the both of them a little bit more than just one person. So I think it's fair to still be critical about Kathleen, but I do think, like Liam said, it seems like there's a lot of top-down decision making and back and forth between that has really affected everything that Kathleen discussed in her exit interview.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's still things obviously she's holding back, but this has been a challenging time. I mean, Disney, out of all studios, has really been one of the ones that has gone through it over the last 6 years because 2019, they couldn't really have been on a higher high. I mean, even with the Rise of Skywalker kind of closing out their year in an unceremonious fashion, they launched Disney Plus incredibly well. They had a huge hit with Mandalorian on there. They had Endgame in 2019. They had everything rolling. And then the transition from Bob Iger to Bob Chapek just didn't go the way they wanted it to. That started kind of this spiral. On top of that, you had the COVID pandemic, which shut down their biggest business, which is theme parks. So there was a big spiral, and I think it played into everything. And with Star Wars being kind of their only success that was able to actually still make them money in terms of the fact that it was on Disney Plus and succeeding, I think it was kind of an overall forced mandate of like Star Wars is Disney Plus. Like, let's get more Star Wars on Disney Plus, and that's kind of where this whole thing is spiraled. Um, Obviously, we don't know that, but it just from context clues seems similar to what ultimately happened, and then that's why they announced so many things so quickly from Star Wars. Colton says Kathleen Kennedy's legacy is tied to the sequels ultimately. It is, and that will be the most important thing she will have overseen. I mean, arguably in her career, but especially in her, what was it, 14 years at Lucasfilm, almost 14 years at Lucasfilm. So it will be her legacy. uh, I would argue Mandalorian would also be kind of right there, or just Star Wars on streaming, considering it was our first ever live action Star Wars show that actually came out. So I think those two things, but the sequels will be her number one piece of her legacy for sure. And then Colton also says, given all the discourse around Dave Filoni, what projects has he truly had his hands on? Well, we know that Dave Filoni obviously was the showrunner slash lead of the Clone Wars. That's obviously his biggest claim to fame, but he was also the co-creator and showrunner of Rebels. So those two times he was more of a he was the showrunner, but he was less involved directly in the like every episode scripts, I would say. More so in the like very much so acting as a George Lucas, more so serving as a story guy and the guy who was getting everything made. the guy who was still leading in the recording booths, directing the actors most of the time, still the person who was the architect of those overall grander stories. That's arguably been his greatest success as a filmmaker. You could also say the same thing as well with Mandalorian. He was the basically the co-producer. He wasn't the showrunner, but he was the co-producer and directed multiple episodes of season 1 and 2 of Mandalorian and seemingly had a bigger role in kind of the overall story structure in season 2. When he mostly stepped away was in season 3, and that was the weakest season because he made Ahsoka that same time they were making season 3. So he had a little less involvement, or at least you could say maybe he was more sporadically involved in season 3. He also was a producer on, I mean, obviously a variety of different things with Star Wars, a writer on a variety of different things, including, writing the Tales of series, being part of the creative team on The Bad Batch, although we know he was definitely less so involved in the overall story structure, but somebody who was definitely creatively involved on that. Part of Boba Fett on a couple episodes, part of Resistance creation because he was head of animation at that time, and then obviously Ahsoka. So that's ultimately his career in Star Wars. And I think a lot of people have remarked on Dave Filoni's either lack of experience with live action, especially having zero experience with live action film, uh, as well as the things he has focused on in live action as flaws on reasons they shouldn't hire him for head of Lucasfilm, president of Lucasfilm. But I think obviously what the president of a company does is not get necessarily involved in the everyday creative process. They help guide their creatives, they help find the right people to tell stories, and if they have an idea, help those creatives continue to pull that story out of them. Not say, no, don't do this, do this. Not say, you have to tell my story. More so, bring the best out of people and unite people. I mean, they like Kathleen Kennedy was the person who unified the team of Filoni and Favreau. Like they had worked together on Clone Wars because Favreau voiced Pre Vizsla, but they hadn't worked together on any creative pursuit really. And she brought them together. It's that type of job that he's going to have more so as president and less so involved in like the dialogue of an episode of a story of a TV show or the exact beat by beat plot points of a movie. And I would argue that the best stuff in his career has come more so from that type of involvement with projects. The Clone Warses, the Rebels, the Mandalorian season 1 and 2s, when he's been more so the guy who's helped oversee projects and help bring them together, bring them to life, and maybe less so the guy who's on set every day making them and the person who's writing every line of dialogue. And I think the same could be said a lot of times about George Lucas, that his best creative pursuits often came from overseeing them rather than pinning the scripts themselves or being the director on set every day. So I think um, I don't think we can look purely at Dave Filoni's resume as a producer or director of live action film as any way just to judge him yet so far on what his success or failure will be at Lucasfilm, because I do think he has shown to be a great unifier and a person who has great knowledge of the Star Wars world that can bring a lot of that knowledge out of different people and help hopefully tell the best stories possible. So I think when it comes to Filoni's resume, even though it is animation, I think we look at Clone Wars and Rebels, and that's a little bit closer to what he's actually going to be doing as president of Lucasfilm rather than what his work on Ahsoka actually was.
Yeah, and I mean, to add to that last point, we don't know what the ultimate opinion of Ahsoka is gonna end up being like. We could be here in 10, 11 months from now being like, "Yeah, okay, he's not at all good at live action," and I think he understands that. I think you don't come into a second season of this show with how much time has passed with all this stuff brewing in the background, like, as Kathleen was saying, this is a 2-year plan. You think he gets cued in last month, like, "Hey, buddy, like, make sure your show's good because 'cause you're next up." It's like, no, like, he is aware of that, and I think as much as I've been critical about him when he comes to kinda overwriting stories and adding weird little things to, like, Tales of the Jedi with another Inquisitor that may or may not be the 1st or 6th Inquisitor, right? Like, stuff like that, I don't like. Stuff like the Kanan retcon of the comic with Bad Batch, right? Like, no, I don't want him to do with that because that's where too much of the George Lucas qualities kinda come through of, like, I'm gonna write the story how I want to write it. It's like, no, it's a whole franchise. I don't care personally what we hear from uh what's his name? Pablo Hidalgo was saying like, "Oh, Star Wars is just like a bunch of different tales and different perspectives put together. There is a true canon. We're not necessarily seeing it. We're just seeing everybody's like collected stories of that." Sure, I'm not saying you can't do that in some cases, it just shouldn't be the standard, right? And I'm okay with living with that, with what we saw at Filoni, right? And just hand waving away some stuff like that, but I just don't want that to become the norm, right? That's a huge reason why, we saw Karen Travis and others leave once George Lucas and came on board with Filoni for the 2008 Clone Wars. Everything that he had approved, conditionally with the 2003 to 2005 Clone Wars multimedia project, everything that had been allowed in small bits during the late 90s and all that about the Clone Wars. Once he really did the prequels, once he got into his own version of the Clone Wars, he overwrote so many different things, all right? Like, and it just didn't work, all right? I know, like, one of the big things about having all those tiers in canon was like, oh, eventually we'll get a unified version of what the Clone Wars was, and that's a little plug for what Liam was able to mostly achieve on his video, so definitely check that out on our channel, but it's not simple, it's not easy, right? So I don't want that sort of involvement from Filoni, all right? And he's not going to necessarily have that anymore. I think that's why when we see the succession plan in place, there is pressure for him on season 2, without a doubt. It's not just the time now, it's like the fact that he is stepping into an unprecedented role for someone of his career trajectory, right? No matter how good Lynwen could be to cover up his flaws or improve his strengths, right? He knows that he is gonna still be that name everyone brings up first because of his connection to the brand, to what he's achieved, to what he has changed about Star Wars himself, and has almost, like, standardized for how people engage with the franchise. So, I expect to see a good season 2. I hope it's not a complete devastation. I think it'll be better than season 1 because he just has, frankly, this reputation of always taking better swings after establishing and trying a couple things out in season 1, and then he discards those things where possible and elevates everything else and builds material around it. His Rebels season 1 is pretty strong, but his season 2 is much, much better. His Clone Wars season 1 is very janky up and down, and once they start getting a lot more linear in the storytelling, which was something that he was adamant about to George Lucas, like, "Hey, I don't want us to just be doing war serials jumping around the 3-year timeline. We should probably understand the fact that this is a TV show for kids. Put lining it up nicely will be better." Once he started taking more and more ownership of the Clone Wars, what happened? Season 2 onwards, from the Rise of the Bounty Hunters onwards, you really start seeing the show develop itself, and then by season 3 and 4, and by 5, it's what people think about when they think Clone Wars. They don't think about those initial episodes like Ambush or Rookies per se. They're thinking about everything that's happening with Captain Rex and everything with that whole storyline that's very much Edge of Darkness and all that, right? You're thinking about that season 6 arc that takes place with Fives and discovering everything that happened there with Order 66 prematurely, right? You're thinking about Mortis. You're thinking about all these weirder, bigger swings, which he had like maybe some credit for overall in the writing, but he's not the main writer for, right? He just has taken over the ownership of, I am the world builder. I'm someone who's going to give you the fuel that is necessary to move forward. So I'm excited for that role for him. I think season 2 will always be an improvement for most of his shows, and I think that's gonna always be the case, and I'm excited for Ahsoka season 2, right? If you're not, understandable, right? But I was personally very pleased with that middle of that show, especially, and I think we can see a lot of that be fleshed out more properly in season 2. And what we saw from Iman Esfandi, right? What we saw from, Natasha Lee Bordisa, what we saw, surprisingly, I think from Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who was everyone thought was, like, the biggest miscast of all the characters, right? I think he did a lot right in getting those characters, those actors in place. I think visually, it's still one of the better looking shows of the whole Mandoverse. It's the one that's definitely kinda have its own unique identity. It's just the story that's not quite there yet. But if it's season 2 hits, and if there's continuation past it, yeah, I'm gonna be excited for it no matter what, because at the end of the day, even if I don't love everything he's done with Ahsoka, he is still the reason we have Ahsoka. He is still the reason that we have some of the best ever stories post prequels through that character. So I'll always be appreciative of that. But like Liam said, I think it's gonna be more of him being that world builder who understands the things to push and pull for other creatives and to encourage them. Just like, Kathleen learned to some degree, but she's not necessarily coming at it in the same purely creative way and understanding and sensibilities that Filoni will have now, right? So hopefully things will be, better with somebody who knows and has direct mentorship from George Lucas that like, hey, this is what makes and feels like Star Wars, and we start to see shows that are, written to the quality of or movies that are written to the quality of Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2 that appeal to all different ages and can continue to grow into their sub-franchises, but at their essence still feel like, "Hey, this is something George Lucas would have, like, definitely wanted to do at some point," or, "This is something that feels like an evolution of his storytelling." And yeah, I'm excited for that. And, like you said, Critical Thinker, Rookies is the first great episode of Clone Wars, not denying that. It's just it's season 1 has so many different arcs jumping around the timeline and all that, that you can very much see more of the George Lucas war serial format as opposed to more standard Clone Wars storytelling and the quality that became established in between very different story arcs.
Well, we got to go back to the Kathleen Kennedy article because there are a few more points that I would like to bring up here before we wrap up. But we're going to keep taking your guys' questions, obviously, throughout the rest of the night. So keep firing them in because there are still some really interesting, juicy pieces of information in this article. So going back to it specifically, again, she was talking about the unmade projects, the things that never happened. She did mention Ryan Johnson's movies. And it's the same thing we've heard over and over again that she mostly blames the fact that he got busy making Knives Out, that he had a big Netflix deal, and that they just ultimately kind of went their own separate ways as things were going. She says once he made the Netflix deal and went off to start doing the Knives Out films, that has occupied a huge amount of his time. That's the other thing that happened here after Sean and I started talking about Star Wars. Sean Levy, she's talking about specifically. Sean went and did Stranger Things, and he was completely consumed for a while, which is also interesting as a little sidebar that it sounds like she was talking to him. Stranger Things season 4 came out back in 2022. So it sounds like she was talking to Sean Levy in like 2020 ish, 2019 about doing Star Wars. That's interesting because it feels like Sean Levy came into the picture more because of Deadpool and Wolverine success, but it sounds like he was on with Star Wars a little earlier than that. Then she says that's what happened with Ryan as well. And then I do believe he got spooked by the online negativity. I think Ryan made one of the best Star Wars movies. He's a brilliant filmmaker and he got spooked. This is the rough part. When people come into this space, I hate every filmmaker and actor has to say to me what's going to happen, or I have every filmmaker and actor say to me what's going to happen, and they're all a little scared, which is an interesting little remark. And then Ryan Johnson, I know, did follow up on this on Twitter and said he was not spooked, and that's not the reason he's not making Star Wars movies, which did definitely start some controversy. But I don't believe for a second he was spooked, and that's the reason why he didn't make it. Maybe he said, I want to take a little time off in 2017 or 2018, right after, the biggest amount of vitriol from The Last Jedi happened. And maybe he said, I'm making this Knives Out movie. I'm going to take a little break from Star Wars because they announced his trilogy, people forget, before The Last Jedi came out. in 2017. So it's been obviously nearly 10 years since his trilogy was announced. I could see that, but I don't think for one second he actually was like, I'm too scared to come make my Star Wars trilogy. So I do feel like this is more so on Lucasfilm not really wanting to make the trilogy. But that's what she had to say about that specifically. Then she addressed Simon Kinberg once again and said, Simon's currently working right now. He wrote something that we read in August and it was very good, but not there. We've pretty much upended the story and then spent a great deal of time on the treatment, which he finished literally about 4 weeks ago. And it's a very detailed treatment, like 70 pages. And so he is expected to give us a script in March, which is interesting because she also mentioned that that's the focus of what Dave Filoni and Lynwen Brennan are going to do first is getting his story off the ground. Again, I fully do believe it's a 10, 11, and 12 or a 10, 11, and 12-esque type of importance in the storytelling. But the fact that he still hasn't completed a script for any of the movies, he's still doing an overall treatment. I mean, I guess it's better that he's working on a treatment for the whole trilogy so that all the ideas are there so he can build one off the other. But I think one of the most interesting pieces of that specific quote is that she says, we've pretty much upended the story. So whatever it was that he was pitching or came up with originally sounds like between Filoni, Brennan, Kathleen Kennedy, and whoever else is involved in the creative process on this, they've just completely picked it apart and tried to shift it and get it to the right place, which is both good and bad. I mean, it sounds negative on the surface, right? But we've been calling for this type of commitment to the details within these stories. And I think if they had something like this level of scrutiny towards the sequel's overall story, or to some of these other TV shows, especially we've seen that haven't been very good, we'd get a lot better product. Now that, the devil's advocate for that could say, well, maybe it's terrible then. That's why they're so scrutinizing so much. And you could be right. It could be terrible, but I'd like to believe and be the optimist and say they just want it to be perfect. And that's why they're taking their sweet time on this and making him do it over and over and over again. And then the final quote she really gives about this is in regards to which projects she's tried to get off the ground and talent she has approached for Star Wars projects. And I found this to be kind of a surprising comment just in general. Definitely one of those like, hey, we tried kind of things, but like, I mean, they went after the big fish for sure. So in regards to TV, she approached Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and this year's Pluribus to make Star Wars, she says. She also had conversations with David Fincher on a Star Wars movie. As all you probably know, David Fincher, the creator of Seven, Fight Club, all those movies. And then she also sat down with Alex Garland, who many of you probably don't know, but he recently just directed Civil War and Warfare, but he also was the writer behind the original 28 Days Later. He also directed Annihilation and Ex Machina, two movies with Star Wars actors in them. I think Annihilation's super underrated, but he's a great writer and a pretty good director in his own right as well. She approached him, and she also said, and others, where the minute you say their name, you go, ooh, that might be an interesting Star Wars film. But she didn't say their names, which, either means these three are definitely not happening, or she's trying to get the fandom to maybe convince these three to work on Star Wars. So I thought that was interesting overall, especially from the TV side. I mean, going after Vince Gilligan, we know they had at one point Benioff and Weiss, who were the hottest names in TV for a while. So they've gone after some big fish when it comes to TV. But I can't imagine David Fincher working on Star Wars. But we've have talked about it in the past that there were rumors he was approached by Lucasfilm to do Star Wars. But Alex Garland, I think, is the most interesting name. I think he would write an incredible Star Wars script. It would be really different, probably more of a Tony Gilroy-esque Star Wars script than a Dave Filoni-esque Star Wars script. But I think that would be really fascinating. And the final piece of the story, they asked her if she had any regrets. And she said, no, I don't have any regrets. Well, actually, maybe a bit of regret about Solo. I brought Larry Kasdan on, and we were excited about the idea. And then when you're into something and you realize fundamentally, conceptually, you cannot replace Han Solo, at least right now, as wonderful as Alden Ehrenreich was, and he was really good and is a wonderful actor, we put him in an impossible situation. And once you're in it and once you're committed, you've got to carry on. But I think I have a bit of regret about that, but not about the movie making and filmmaking itself. I don't have any regrets about that. I just think conceptually, we did Solo too soon. So those were her final thoughts on the interview. A lot of stuff to unpack there, Senek. We have David Fincher, Alex Garland, Vince Gilligan all possibly doing Star Wars at one point. We have Simon Kinberg not fully turning in a script yet, working on a treatment, scrutinizing his treatment. We have her saying Ryan Johnson was spooked out of doing Star Wars, but he said I was not spooked out of doing Star Wars. Lots of stuff there. What stood out to you about those last few points?
The Ryan Johnson one, I think it was how quick he responded. Um, I don't think she's lying per se. I think spooked is the wrong word. I think he was just like disinterested in
Yeah.
immediately returning, right? And I know there were a lot of rumors that his trilogy would also intersect with Benioff and Weiss, who at one point were rumored to be developing 5 films, right? And yeah, it's just okay. Like I think the ideas around it and what he's shared with them are still exciting for them. It's just not fitting in with anything right now with the lack of direction that there was there until like this transition plan really has been put in place until we started seeing Starfighter finally be put into production and all that, right? Starfighter is leading the way. I don't think it's just gonna be like, oh, we did that and Mandalorian Grogu was like an adaptation of part of season four, and we maybe get a season four, or maybe get more. I think it's like with Starfighter, we're actually starting to open up the floodgates. We just aren't ready to tell you guys that yet because we wanna keep our cards to our chest, and when it comes to Ryan Johnson's thing, and unfortunately, the internet will not ever let him forget, right? Like, there are people genuinely who do not like the film, right? I know Lee has his interest in that film has gone down a little bit, certain things don't work as much. For me, it's always kinda stayed stable, right? I do really enjoy it quite a bit. It's, I think, my number 4, my number 5 of the 9, right? So it's firmly in the middle of the pack right there. But, yeah, this idea that, he's like, "I wasn't spooked," like, I remember being on not on Twitter directly, but seeing him constantly respond to everybody, like, after The Last Jedi had come out, usually very positively, but that still speaks about someone who is hearing and feeling everything, right? So, for him to be very jumpy on this in some ways, I think it's like him and Kathleen having 2 different opinions on something that they're both slightly off about. I think for her, when she says spooked, I don't think she means, like, spooked from the filmmaking process, just spooked from, like, all the instability on our side and not being able to really take a big stab at this, and with how everything unfolded at Netflix and he had full ownership and how great it was for his reputation, knowing that at the end of the day, this is a business and Johnson's gonna prioritize preparing his image in the public eye as opposed to diving and double dipping in a franchise that has a little bit more mixed sensibilities and feelings, right? I think that's what she was trying to say. Spook just probably comes off a little too harshly. But for him too, I just don't know if he's quite yet ready. I think he's really enjoyed being a mostly, Netflix TV-esque sort of guy. He had Poker Face 2 for 2 seasons, kind of still shopping that around. That's where he started. He's had movies, sure, but most of his success is still truly in TVs. It really is just what he's had with, you could say Looper to some degree, but mostly what he's had with these 3 Knives Out films, right, that has really propelled his career. It's very rare for someone to have a breakout success like he did with the first Knives Out, and then have someone be like, "Yeah, you could be offered a continuation in the studio for like another 20 million, or you could get full rights and ownership as long as you do it through Netflix for 500 million," right? Like he is in a totally different position, and when you have that sort of money, that sort of like ownership and that freedom, like why would he want to come back to this playground where he would probably have those same sort of restrictions? So I don't think he's spooked about it. I think he just values himself a little too strongly, maybe for what Lucasfilm is looking for. But once things are maybe hopefully like rolling again with Lucasfilm's slate, then I think they'll find some sort of medium ground. I think personally, even if we don't get a trilogy out of him ever again or any sort of like individual disconnected Star Wars sort of storytelling, I would not be surprised, especially with some of his comments in the past, if like he wants to like, show up and direct for an episode in someone else's TV show and all that. I think that's a great entry point for him again. It's harder to review that stuff. I know you people will. The internet is, I believe, since 2024 has more bots than it does human interaction. So no matter what, I'm expecting negative scores for him. But it's a lot easier to just do a one and done couple episodes here and there, and then saying like I'm leading the whole direction of like a whole trilogy of films. And yeah, we don't have any other true trilogy, right? Like we only have the prequels, the sequels, and the original trilogy. We don't have another Star Wars trilogy of movies yet. So he would have that additional pressure too of like that inevitable comparison of like a formula that has been in play for Star Wars since the 70s. So I think there's a lot of jockeying back and forth in both in positions, both the reality of the situation, like where they stand, Kathleen exiting, Ryan certainly in some sort of ascension, right? So it's a very interesting comment for her to say. I think this is just one of those cases where when you talked about an interview that definitely is edited, that it's definitely not just unedited 1 hour, 2 hours, it's probably closer to 3 hours in full discussion pieced together. She probably said something that stuck out, but it was never truly followed up on when it could have been something a little bit more, you know, layered of an answer like she has for a lot of the other things that she had in the exit interview. Um, Fincher, I know we talked about it like a month or two ago. I believe the rumor is that he wanted final edit, which is not something Disney is gonna give to anybody, right? It's just a fact now. If this was independent and it was George Lucas, I don't wouldn't be surprised if he gave it to him because that's one of the biggest things for Fincher. Unfortunately, at a traumatic level as a filmmaker, his first real big film was Alien 3, and he was locked out of the editing room. So I think ever since then, he has refused having his vision be compromised at the very end, right? Maybe he can accept some sort of things here and there during pre and post during production, but post is like where you're really having a stamp on your film. And especially with how George Lucas would say he'd kind of reinvent and find the films that he was making in the post production room, that sort of legacy that's pervasive throughout Star Wars as a brand. To him to come into the brand and not have at least some majority of control over the edit room, yeah, I can see why he wouldn't be in it. I would love it. I would love it. I'd love him to do something that is like Andor-esque, like tonally, maybe even be in that same timeline, that same room, right? Maybe be a little bit more about like naval warfare or like imperial politics, or maybe in the whole, post sequels or something like that. I'd love for him to do something to deal with like what we think is ultimately going to be a hugely faction based galaxy instead of just a centralized government of one or two, right? I think he'd totally thrive in that, or do something like uglier, like a Fight Club where you are dealing with like the dirtier, scummier parts of the galaxy and the opportunities that they see, right? I think you could absolutely cook with something like that. But have we ever seen him do anything less than rated R for the most part? No, not really. So I can understand why Disney would be like, we can't let you do a rated R film, buddy. Like it's just really not what we're known for or have ever really attempted with Star Wars. But I'm sure they would let him push it. Just it does, like you said, it seems like they put that name out in Kathleen's exit interview because him and Garland are, like, not in contention right now. I don't think Vince truly ever was in contention. This guy is his own industry at this point, right? I don't see him being willing to be connected to, Star Wars and be part of that machine, right? But if he ever does, I'd love to see Jesse Plemons in Star Wars. That would be so good, and, Aaron Paul and all that, like, Bryan Cranston, bring back most of Breaking Bad cast, and I'll be down, right? I'd love something like that. We already got Bill Burr. If he does something with Bill Burr as, like, a spin-off series, that'd be hilarious to me, but, um, yeah, that probably is not happening. Garland, I haven't seen much from him recently, to be fair, but like you said, he's got a great reputation, a lot of flexibility. Already worked with Domhnall Gleeson, already worked with Oscar Isaac. So if they do something cool with them, I'd love for him to have a stab in this post-sequel world. Would be very interesting. And as far as what we talked about, that really big point about the Kinberg trilogy, yeah, I mean, that's the one that's been, like, constantly talked about and been growing steadily over, like, the last 2 years, if not 3, 4, right? I think people don't understand that he actually has a strong connection to Star Wars. He worked on Rebel Season 1. Rebel Season 1, when it came out, was, like, shockingly well received because, he worked on a lot of the story treatment there, and, there are things about Ezra that are annoying. It is TVY7 and all, but that is still really well done for a first season of animation, right? I think the only thing that has surpassed it so far right now is Bad Batch season 1. And Bad Batch, you can say Brad Rao and his team have worked through Clone Wars, have worked through Rebels, Resistance, and all that, so they've had the years of experience to do something like that, versus Kinberg kinda was like, "This is my first real stab at it." I don't know what the real reason was for him leaving. I know he was offered to do Dark Phoenix and stuff like that around the same time, so maybe that's why he didn't continue with Rebels, but I always do wonder what he would have done differently or what he would have added to Rebels, but he has a reputation, right, already within Lucasfilm of being a success, right? He has worked directly with Filoni. I understand this almost feels like a move made in anticipation of Filoni taking over here, right? So, treatment-wise, hearing it's 70 pages or so, I'm very happy about that. I think that's how he should be handled. I don't necessarily believe in him as a scriptwriter. I think we've seen, despite working on a lot of projects that have obviously been meddled with and changed out of his hands, I don't think he's still, like, the strongest guy to do a 10, 11, and 12. No matter what, I think everybody at Lucasfilm is like 10, 11, 12 to be the most well-planned thing in Star Wars. So if it's a treatment, if it's an understanding of the world, of the characters, of the factions, of the Force and everything, and that's where he leaves it at, as, like, a starting base for these scripts and general ideas for how these 3 films will work, I'm okay with that. I like him almost working in that quasi Filoni role that Filoni's kinda occupied already in the last couple years, and essentially to some degree since Clone Wars. But yeah, I don't know, the idea of this being 10, 11, 12, it does give me a little bit of pause because it almost feels like if they're gonna announce it as 10, 11, 12, they need to be very, very specific and uh, um, flags planted for the post-sequel trilogy spin-off era of sorts that's happening. Like, we need to have Starfighter 2 already in production. We need to know the state of New Jedi Order, The Hunt for Ben Solo, and those characters. We need to at least know and have shots of all of these characters in some films or on set or something on these different spin-offs that are gonna be branching out and building this post-sequel world and actually making the sequel feel like an era instead of just a little tip of the iceberg, right? And a lot of the discussion, a lot of the way they talked about the sequels recently, with creators who have been around Lucasfilm, around Star Wars, is that it really is just where things explode, and then now we pick up the pieces, right? That it seems like they're very committed to that idea of, like, this is where the era really begins, when everything is resettled, when the old that has been gone is gone, and the new that is settled has at least a few footholds into what the story is gonna look like moving forward. So for me, ideally, I think the Kinberg trilogy that I'd be interested in, especially with how Kathleen's talked about, like, it's not quite there and all that. I think it's speaking more to a combination of all the ideas they have for Rey, as opposed to just having her be older. Like, I think we're too close in the timeline, right, with how these actors look and age so far. I personally don't think 10, 11, 12 should be the move yet. I think this should be more of like, we're taking the new Jedi Order film, we're taking The Hunt for Ben Solo and some other ideas, and we're making a trilogy of that and making them have their own sort of trilogy. They are still the 2 most popular parts of the new characters and the new ideas that came out of the sequels. We know that Lucasfilm was almost caught off guard by Soderbergh and Adam Driver being so adamant about this being a film and that they greenlit it without any questions, right? And that would have maybe been the first film. Now maybe they're trying to figure out the balance, like which one comes first? Where do these appearances for Rey kinda start to begin to stack up? Do we hit a new Jedi Order trilogy out of this, or do we make this focused on making this like a dyad trilogy? whatever it is, I think it's gonna be a little bit more of, like, dealing with after the first initial 5, 6 years, more like closer to the 10-year mark. I don't think that's quite enough of a gap for me personally to say, like, that's ready for 10, 11, 12. I would prefer something 20 plus at least, and I just don't think these actors with modern Hollywood and beauty and all that have aged to a point of being like, "Yeah, I want Rey to start taking on that Obi-Wan Kenobi, old Luke Skywalker role." I wanna see them have the chance that, Disney and its money offers that we never truly got with the prequel trilogy characters, but we've started to see a little bit with Obi-Wan Kenobi and some, like, de-aging and all that, that we'll never truly get with, the original trilogy cast, right? Of, like, letting these actors and characters and stories grow, get settled, and then if we really have to do 10, 11, 12, make it happen, right? I think we're just a little early on that. I don't want that to be, like, the first announcement of what Lynwen and Dave are doing, 'cause it puts way too much of a burden right away, and I'd love Star Wars to become a place for actors and directors to experiment and find and grow and fit into a system and still stand out. I know Kathleen definitely wanted to do that, but the people she was working with were Lucas or Spielberg, the auteurs of blockbuster filmmaking. We haven't seen another revolution happen since, so yeah, I think it's a little too early for me personally. And then for my final point, you know, whatever she's kinda said about Solo, I disagree with. I think it's truly just a film that if you came out in December, it makes an easy 100,000,000, 150,000,000 more. I know it was the most expensive Star Wars film ever made because they redid it completely all over again, right? And I know Kazan has been very vocal about what did or didn't work. But this idea that we can't recast characters when that's quite literally what we did for the prequel trilogy, and now we're using those actors now moving forward. Rumors about Ewan McGregor even taking on the old Ben Kenobi look with some makeup and prosthetics and stuff, right, moving forward. It's one of those things that I just don't understand. I understand there has to be an investment in AI, and she's talked about, like, how we have to be responsible about AI, we need to be in this exit interview that she has some excitement around it, but she doesn't wanna diminish the creativity of people working on this stuff. Saying all the right things there, but then how can you continue to say recasting doesn't work when Star Wars literally has worked with that, right? It's just a shame because I think Alden, especially if we get this Lando film, has to show up in some sort of form. You don't have this Han and Lando relationship that we see in the initial scene in episode 5 just happen like that. And like you're saying, critical thinker, yeah, there probably is a push from Disney with AI. I know they're saying a lot of user content's gonna be on, uh, on Disney Plus. They did that OpenAI partnership, which frankly, I think is a bit silly because they're already pushing ads on their services, and Google has Gemini, which won't have ads for a while. They've had the whole data bank of the internet for nearly 30 years. It's already a losing battle for them, and if anything, right? But yeah, this push for AI, maybe she has to be careful about what she's saying there, but recast, man, recast. Use AI for, like, changing someone's nose or something, or, like, making almost, like, digital prosthetics for these actors. But if you're ever gonna truly make this New Republic era fly and not just be beholden to these newer characters and the ups and downs of transitioning between different mediums like animation and comics to live action, simplest thing to do is just to accept that the original trilogy has never got a chance to continue moving forward, and this is your chance to really tell these stories and build them out and give you more reasons to make comics and books and stories and everything and build off of that, while still also doing your post-sequel trilogy characters and that whole timeline. It's simple. I think continuing the deep fake with the aversion that people are having more and more to AI, more things being done by hand, like things like Demon Slayer just today, like seeing the studio be like, "We'll never do generative AI." Everything you've seen in Infinite Cancel is hand drawn. They're showing their illustrations for that and how massive that movie was to make $1 billion plus dollars and stuff like that. It's just like, or not 1 billion, but quite a lot of money, right? It's just people are pushing away from it. I think when we saw Book of Boba Fett and what it managed to do with Luke there, I loved it. But me personally, I know I've moved away from, like, wanting a truly deepfake performance. I just want the technology to be used smartly, to make things more efficient, to elevate the human creators behind it, and especially when it comes to it at the end of it all, things are more lively and more human when you have a real person doing these things and performing these characters. People will very easily get over how someone acts or looks because we've already seen it with arguably the original Star Wars Jedi and Obi-Wan Kenobi with Ewan McGregor, who's now more beloved than Alec Guinness ever was. So, yeah, I that's one of the things from her exit interview, as informative as it was, I just found that to either be corporate speak from her or just an opinion that I just can't really stick with.
I agree and disagree with her on that point. I mean, I think it was too soon. We had just seen Han Solo less than a year and a half before as Harrison Ford. I think if they were gonna recast, you wait until the sequel trilogy is over and then do a origin story. They were just so convinced that name of character from Star Wars will sell a movie. Um, and I think it would have honestly if they had actually done the legwork with the marketing, but they didn't know marketing for that movie. So I agree with her that I think it was way too soon to do a solo, but I disagree with her that you can't recast if that's what she's trying to say, because I do think recasting is the only way forward with those characters unless you want to only tell their stories in books, which I'm also good with because I like Star Wars books. But if you're gonna do deep fake or any type of AI face, I just don't see. I see the novelty in it, and I think it's fine for one scene. I think it's fine for a small cameo role in a movie or a show, but I don't think it just can't carry that same level of human emotion, and regardless of whether it looks real or not, it's just gonna feel weird no matter what, because you know that's not that person. So, I think it's a lot more easy to attach yourself to a person than it is to AI, and I think in even though in hindsight it was way too early to do Solo, the response overall from the Star Wars community that people actually really like Solo, like there's still to me there's a crazy amount of Solo stands out there for a movie that I think is just good. It's not great, and I don't think there are many people who would be out there going Solo is great, but it shows the power of like if you can get that stuff right and you tell a compelling story even if it's just good, people will stand by it because there will be enough people out there who like that and enjoyed that. And so uh, I think we will see more of that at some point. So to wrap up all the Kathleen Kennedy stuff, because we do have a few more stories to talk about and I want to take more of your guys' questions, I want to turn to you guys and read some of the last few questions and points about Kathleen Kennedy. And I'm going to start with a question I'm going to drop here in the chat. And this was from yesterday's stream that crashed. And it was from Brandon, who said, "What do you think were Kathleen Kennedy's, or what do you think were Kathleen Kennedy had more highs or lows when she was in charge? Do you think Kathleen Kennedy had more highs or lows when she was in charge of Lucasfilm?" And we got similar questions from other people as well throughout the chat, from people like Critical Thinker to people like Batuu, to True Shepherd's opinions on Kathleen Kennedy. So I think just to kind of we'll bring your guys' opinions into the conversation, but to just kind of have the final word on her as the president. I think there were undoubtedly quite a few successes in her run. I mean, namely, if you want to be objective, looking from a business perspective, she launched Disney Plus with arguably their most popular show they've ever had. Not arguably, I mean, I think it single-handedly is their most popular show they've ever had on Disney Plus in The Mandalorian. She made 4 $1 billion plus movies out of 5. One of those still holds the record for the most money ever made in the United States or North America, and I don't think that record's getting broken anytime soon. It's such a gigantic record, and especially in the post-COVID world, even with inflation, I mean, I think it'll take decades before that's broken. They almost made $1 billion on The Force Awakens, in just North America. So objectively, there were quite a few highs. And then on top of that, getting Star Wars into like the awards race, getting the Mandalorian nominations for Best Emmy, getting Andor, which got nominations for best drama at the Emmys. There were quite a few successes. But I do think if we're looking at it from a little bit more subjective level and just what the overall franchise is and has been, I think there were more lows than highs, even with the objective successes. The sequel trilogy is for you can take it for what it is, wherever your opinion is on it. You might love it. You might love a couple movies and hate some. You might think it's terrible all the way around. I know for me personally, I'm still a fan of The Force Awakens. My excitement about Force Awakens has gone down over the years just purely because I know I'm not a huge fan of the last two-thirds of the trilogy anymore, but I still really enjoy that as a movie, and I think it was the Star Wars movie we really needed at the time for the where Star Wars was. So I still feel very similarly about The Force Awakens to how I felt the day I saw it. It's just a little less exciting to watch nowadays because there's nothing to speculate on. There's nothing to theorize about. It's just we know where it goes, and it's not a great ending. Last Jedi, I'm still mixed on. There are some scenes I absolutely love. There are some visuals I love. There are some things that I really don't like, and ultimately, I think it's a pretty mixed bag movie with probably more negatives than positives overall, but the positives are super strong. The Rise of Skywalker have completely soured on over time. So I think if you look at the trilogy, I think even to the best case scenario, it was mixed reception. So I would give her a win for Force Awakens. I'd give her a win for The Mandalorian. I'd give her a win for Andor. Then on some smaller scale stuff, Star Wars Rebels win. I think obviously Clone Wars season 7 win and arguably made Clone Wars what it is today. I mean, Clone Wars has had its roller coaster in terms of popularity. It started out really low, got pretty popular amongst the dozen people who were watching it, like me and Sonic when it was coming out, and then when it went on Netflix, it got a big bump, but its Netflix bump wasn't anywhere near the bump it got in COVID on Disney Plus when season 7 came out and the hype around season 7. So all of that was a plus, and I think overall the handling of Star Wars animation was pretty positive. We got shows like Bad Batch, we got the Tales of series, we got Visions. So for the most part, animation was pretty strong under her. I think the thing that was the biggest mixed bag of all is TV because she jumped us into live action TV in a very positive way. I still really love Mandalorian season 1 and 2. Then we had Boba Fett, which was the first drop in quality with a couple high highs, but the story overall was a mess. Obi-Wan, I think, was the first true disappointment to a lot of people because no matter what, I don't think there are very many people who think it's an outstanding series, and I think it has the bones of something that could have been outstanding. But even if you like it, it wasn't the masterpiece that a lot of us wanted. So I think that was the first real drop in terms of live action quality. Then you followed it up with Andor, which was obviously a huge win, and you followed it up with Ahsoka, which is a mixed bag. Season 3 of Mandalorian, mixed bag. Skeleton Crew, I think has that solo reception kind of where the people who watched it seem to have enjoyed it. I don't think anybody will argue it's one of the greatest Star Wars things ever, but those people who watched it did really like it, but it has had a hard time picking up any traction. Um, and The Acolyte, I think, was a complete disaster. So it's a real mixed bag of like I would say she's batting like about 500 with TV shows. I think there's a lot of positives, a lot of negatives. Animation overall win, but I do think in terms of where the brand is now as she's leaving, I think there were overall more lows in terms of the reception of Star Wars, especially in the last 5 years. But it's inarguable that she has given us some of the best Star Wars stuff we've seen in animation, in TV. I think it's just that live action film spot where it's unfortunate we couldn't get a more general consensus on a truly great slate of Star Wars movies. Because I think when all is said and done, Rogue One's going to be the one that has the most goodwill towards it, and that was actually one of the ones that was a little more mixed received critically when it came out. So it's like it's interesting the way the fandom has ebbed and flowed, but it's a very interesting tenure, and for somebody to take a franchise that had only put out 6 movies and two animated shows in the prequel era and 4 total animated shows in the history of its run in over 30 years, 35 years when she took over, and to increase that to over 30 total projects. There was a lot that we can, credit her for, but I think because of there being so much stuff out there, there was more to pick apart as well. So, uh, yeah, I don't think her tenure is as much of a failure as a lot of people would say, but I would say the way it's gone out, the like dearth of Star Wars content, the seemingly all-time low interest in the franchise, especially compared to other competing franchises, with an increased amount of stuff that has come out over the last few years. I think that speaks to why she stepped down ultimately is just there needed to be a little bit of a refresh. But I do think it's undeniable there are some incredible successes overall for her tenure as Lucasfilm president.
I'm a little bit more positive on this. I'd say I mostly agree. And I think if we had asked this question in 2022, I think we'd both be a little bit more positive overall on it. It's just more like you said, it's that live action Mandoverse inconclusivity of like the direction of how that's going and all that. That's what's really bogged her down because the thing is, even when she's made mistakes or been involved with projects that haven't done so well, her next project at a certain point would just shoot her right back up, right? So yeah, you could say Rise of Skywalker with her and JJ like begging Iger for like, hey, we need more runtime, we need more time on this. Make even an episode 10, which is a conclusion for the whole Star Wars saga, Skywalker saga, and then let 9 be a conclusion to just episode 7, 8, and 9 story. They were denied, sure, 100%, but still failures that will be attributed to them. But yeah, Mandalorian came out. I don't think anyone's gonna forget Luke Skywalker returning in the end of season 2 and the hype of that and like grifters and fanatics galore, right? Everybody's unified saying this was it. We're like we've really done it. Like Favreau and Filoni of State Star Wars, and she put them together, right? She's the one who took their different and competing Mandalorian ideas. Was like, you guys should probably sit in a room together and figure out something together, and it worked, right? So I think in 2022, I'd say she's closer to like 65 to 75% of things right for me. I think, especially because of just how negative the reception was with Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi, people would probably say no, no, below 500. But for me, I'm someone who thinks 7 was a right choice in a lot of ways, but is very derivative. It should have had more to it, and I think that's something where coming from her production company with her husband Marshall, and then stepping into this role, if she had probably done a more proper transition of maybe like handling Lucasfilm for the last couple of years under George, and then gone into this, maybe she would have actually had a little bit more of George's sensibilities, and we wouldn't have comments like George at the red carpet saying like this isn't the Star Wars I would have made, right? A little too safe and all that, right? We would have probably heard him say like, "Yeah, there were things that I thought were safe, but things I thought were pretty interesting that, were from my treatments and stuff like that," right? So, still really enjoy 7 in a lot of ways, but I find it just to be a little too derivative at times, even if that was what the fandom was begging for. I think she should have also been a little bit more. I know you have to be aligned at that point. You're relaunching Star Wars, you're soft launching it all again for a lot of people, but the idea of, like, letting JJ be like, "Oh, I put Jar Jar's bones on Jakku," and all that, and letting that be part of marketing, I think was silly. I think just too much unity in that place in a specific direction. I also allowed a lot of the negative voices to then seem practical as opposed to just being just negative voices, right? And letting JJ do his whole mystery box thing, I'm never gonna truly love because at least with Lost, he had Lindelof. Here, it's like, "Oh, okay, JJ, you're writing this, you're directing this, you're working off an art script and all that." Like, yeah. That being said, I still like the film quite a bit. I am in the same boat for The Last Jedi. I find that to be my favorite of the sequel trilogy, but do I think it's a great connective film to Episode 7? No, I don't. I think that it's like an anti-trilogy. Every single film is actually pretty decent, but then when you connect them together, you're like, "What's going on?" There are things that, if we had the prequel era mentality that I think, again, Kathleen should have adopted of, like, you have to flush out products that are in games, and TV shows, and animation, and comics, and books to actually continue to grow out the era and make it feel like an era, we wouldn't have as many issues as we do right now between 7, 8, and 9, especially with how truncated that timeline is. I I'm glad that Ryan Johnson had a great time with the Lucasfilm Story Group and all that, and I do believe he made the Star Wars film that he wanted to make, but that's where she needs to have almost the opposite effect, right? She has to now be a little bit more, pushing back against what Ryan is doing, right? Uh, I think she just needed to insert herself a little bit more than she did in those two films. And if she had given us like a 2, 3 year jump, you would have had a nice little era to work with. And I truly believe someone would have already started some animation or some sort of big books to have it fleshed it out. Being literally minutes afterwards, it's just tough. It's just tough, right? And then you could have had the still 1 year gap between 8 and 9 still works. So structurally, I think not being able to have worked under Lucasfilm for a little bit at the beginning, she still delivered billion-dollar films, but I think she didn't necessarily deliver Lucas-styled Star Wars films, and we're gonna be working on that moving forward, and just that lack of commitment to the sequel era, I'm gonna falter on. I think even if it is a mandate from Iger, even if it is what the analytics said, you've got a little proof in concept with George of like, hey, even if people don't love it, eventually you make something in this era that people will love that can recolor and change people's opinions. And then the kids who grew up with all this stuff, they'll have all these reasons and all these different things to point out to. So I think that is a big failure that I could also fully test Iger too, but I believe it has to be shared between the directors that she worked with and with Iger as a whole. So sequel trilogy, financial success, I think it has enough strong creative points, but it's not a success as an era. So I would say that for sure. TV shows, again, I think she started off really strong. Like you said, that dip that happens after Book of Boba Fett begins. It's unfortunate. I think some of it has to be attested to COVID too. I think Kenobi would have been even better than it was, right? I think we would have seen a lot less of controversy around it. Hopefully, we would have seen a much better design for the Grand Inquisitor and stuff like that come and play if we had more money and more time, better de-aging for Hayden and Ewan. But I still think it's a decent show. It's just not anywhere near the level of something that was at one point planned out as a movie trilogy, right? So, yeah, I more time, not having the issues with COVID, I think would have made a little bit of those middle ground projects that happened around that time to be a little bit more consistent in their quality. But, yeah, I mean, having the biggest issue I will still say is that not having a big push or her even in her exit interview saying something about, like, we should have saved, Grogu's return for Mando season 3 and not have it directly in Book of Boba Fett. I wish she had said something like that because to me, it just seems like she's in line with that decision and letting Favreau and Filoni have full control of that when we know that timeline-wise, they've been so bad about it. They're like, "Yeah, it all takes place 9 ABY." It's like, "What? No, Navarro is not being that developed that quickly, right, with how the timeline of the story is. It's probably like a year and a half or 2 or stuff like that." So, yeah, stuff like that, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of. But then you hear stories about, like, how she championed Andor. Absolutely, Andor doesn't exist without her. Tony Gilroy is like, "Everything I threw at her, she said yes, yes, and yes to." I think that's a sign of someone who had understood that this is very similar to how it was when I was working with George and Spielberg, when they had some crazy, incredible ideas that would change filmmaking, like with Indiana Jones, with E.T., with all these other incredible '80s and '90s films. When she saw something be there conceptually, she let everything grow out of it, and I think Andor the fact that there are people who only watch Andor and hate everything else about Star Wars and, like, want the rest of Star Wars to be like that speaks to just how well she captured another part of the audience by trusting Gilroy. I think to down to play Andor when we're hopefully moving into a future where it has more connective tissue to the rest of Star Wars, we've seen Gilroy be one of the better people at connecting everything else Star Wars-wise in that timeline of the dark times of Star Wars Rebels and everything. I think it just speaks to, well, by the end of her tenure, she seemed to have at least recouped a little bit of direction again of like, "Okay, this things make sense. This is a new idea, but let these creators really cook." And I think Andor is just something that you can say like, "Oh, I have all these issues with Disney Stars," but if you look at Andor and don't give her credit for it, I think that's just fraudulent of an opinion. And, I as much as I'm not the biggest fan of and we've talked about this, both Liam and I on the channel, of not having more expansive publishing storytelling. I think comics overall have been quite strong. I found it to be a lot stronger than, a lot of the late '90s, early 2000s. You can make more arguments for Republic onwards and the storytelling there, but overall, the way it expanded stuff that we've got comic exclusive characters that are, like, known to the general public, like Dr. Aphra and all that, I think comics have, for the most part, been pretty good. I just think 2020, again, COVID, publishing changes, distribution, and all that really affected things, and letting Marvel play the game of, like, jumping between all these main lines and saying, "Hey, we're gonna have all these crossover series," limited how effective the storytelling was there when we saw how strong a lot of 2015 stories ended up being. Um, Books, like we said again, should have been more expansive, but she is someone who absolutely championed the High Republic. If anything, publishing is where you'll have less pushback, and creating a structure in place for multiple authors, multiple mediums to really build out a proper initiative in the High Republic and the well reception that it's gotten there, right? The diversity of it all and the strong conclusion with Trials of the Jedi, the fact that we technically got Acolyte out of it too, right? That's a huge big swing, and even if it didn't land, I'm really appreciative of her being involved in all steps to that. I think publishing, she has to get a lot of credit for the end of her tenure, especially when it comes to books. More the start of her tenure with the comics, but end of her tenure with books. So, yeah, she probably did better in animation than anything else. She probably did better, in books and comics than she did in movies, which stalled out, and TV shows after 2022. She never had these things consistently line up with each other. But for me, I think she's, like, batting at, like, a .600. I think she's done more positive than negatives for me, and I think part of this transition is her trying to instill the strength of what she's achieved, be very objective with Lynwen, with Dave about these are the things I struggled with. These are things I think your strengths will take over. These are things you have to look out for. And I'm hoping we'll have a strong start with Dave and all that, and hopefully we do get this true sequel explosion, and we truly get New Republic recasting and all that. But yeah, it is a shame that it could have been a bit better if these things had lined up. They just never truly did.
And I think that's too another one you have to look at with like the extraneous stuff is it it is a lot for Kathleen Kennedy. And again, we don't know how much of this is her fault or Disney's fault or just the other context that can be around it. But so we're just framing her era, not specifically her as a leader. But I do think the thing ultimately that's going to be the biggest thing that mires her final 5, 6 years is the fact that they just couldn't get anything made. And that's even with the COVID stuff, even with all the strikes and the other issues thrown at her and at Lucasfilm, every other studio was facing those problems and still at least made stuff. Star Wars hasn't made anything, which is like that to me is the gonna be the final thing I kind of remember of the end of this tenure is just the fact that we got almost nothing for the last few years in terms of new content. Almost everything we got were successive seasons. We got a Mandalorian movie, which is spinning off from, the show. We just couldn't get these projects off the ground. And I think that's when we talk about wins and losses, definitely going to be more on the loss end is just the the complete lack of ability to get Star Wars made. I do think that's going to be ultimately with the sequels kind of the biggest marks on the overall resume of these last 15 years under Kathleen Kennedy. Because when we got stuff made, there were just as many positives as negatives. I think Andor is the one true giant that you can grab and be like, this is all time Star Wars. I think outside of that, it's hard to find too many things that are all time Star Wars, which is frustrating when it's a 15-year period where we have the most Star Wars content produced. And even I'm saying that even with books and comics as well. I think comics gets a lot closer, but books, it is a frustrating cycle of continually telling stories that don't ultimately impact the galaxy like they did when George ran it. So I think that will also be something I look at as kind of a mid to slightly negative part of this tenure. But overall, there were still quite a few wins. I really do think it's so hard to judge and talk about her tenure overall because it is to me so 50-50. It's like every time we have an Andor, then we get an Acolyte. And it's like, oh my God, how can the same studio that's greenlighting an Andor greenlight the Acolyte? And then you get a Mandalorian season 2, and then you get a Book of Boba Fett. And it's like, how can this be the same creative team? How can this be the same creative process, right? It felt so hit and miss. But I think overall, one of the weird things with this tenure for sure will be that Star Wars, the fandom was at an all-time low when she took over, with the relationship between the fans and George Lucas slowly mending, but general interest in Star Wars completely having waned, to the instant revitalization when she took over with Rebels and with The Force Awakens, and then following it up with Rogue One. It felt like Star Wars was bulletproof for the first time in like 30 years, 20 years since Return of the Jedi, really. And then to follow it up with Last Jedi, Solo, Rise of Skywalker, it just felt like a complete 180, a complete flip. And then we get Mandalorian, and it's like, oh, we're back. Then you get Boba Fett and Obi-Wan. Then Andor's back. And then you get Ahsoka, which I like Ahsoka for the most part, but it's a mid. I would say it's probably the most mid thing they've made in terms of like people don't generally hate it, but also there aren't too many people who obsessively love it. Um, and then you get Ahsoka, and then falls completely flat with the Acolyte, and then we finish on Andor season 2. So it was just a complete roller coaster of the last 15 years. You never knew what you're going to get. And ultimately, when we get to the end, truly the final pieces of her legacy and the legacy of this tenure will be Starfighter and Mandalorian Grogu, and like what the ramifications are with that. Because if Starfighter is a huge hit and she's her end of her tenure sets us up on an exciting future for Star Wars, I think that is another notch on the win column for sure. Let's read some of your guys' comments here. This is going to be a little longer stream. Obviously, we're already at 2 hours, but this is one of the most important conversations, and we've been excited to have it with you guys, especially after the failure that was yesterday's stream. So I know you guys have been waiting to talk about it. True Shepherd says, in my opinion, I think Kathleen Kennedy did both a good and bad job. I don't think she was set out to destroy Star Wars like the Fandom Menace says. She made her mistakes, but we are all human and we make mistakes. I think a lot of the decisions she made had the best of intentions. I understand that when Disney bought Lucasfilm, hate for the prequels was still strong, and think she wanted to bring back the nostalgia from the original trilogy, which is why the sequels turned out the way they did. I think that's perfect analysis of the situation overall, Anthony, with what happened with the sequels. I mean, I think the sequels obviously we're really caught between two worlds. I think the reason George Lucas is so, bothered by what they did with the sequels was it was basically people forget he did stay on as president when and then as an advisor the first few years of Disney owning Lucasfilm. He had this transition process. It wasn't just like an overnight, okay, see you guys. He had this whole succession plan set up with Kathleen Kennedy. He had this whole succession plan for the sequels set up. And I think that's what's rubbed him the wrong way over the years, is that that plan that he had set up, all the stuff he had got in motion, they basically, once he was out the door, they just kind of said, whatever, we're not doing this anymore. And I think that obviously made him feel like, well, what was the point of me setting all this stuff up with you guys? Um, but when it comes to the sequels, they absolutely felt that pressure from the fans, and that's why we got the movies we got, especially The Force Awakens. We got that movie because of the pressure of the anti-sequel sentiment that was there, or sentiment that was there at the time. So that's correct on your analysis, and I agree with you that she did both a good and bad job. Um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, she tried to do her best for Star Wars. I mean, that was her job, and so she wasn't trying to destroy the franchise. She was literally handpicked by George Lucas, not by Disney. So that's obviously wasn't her intention. But yeah, thanks for that comment. Critical Thinker says, "Oh, wait, that's about Filoni, so I'll skip that one and we'll come back to it." Joshua says, "I think Kathleen did good with the marketing and diversity for Star Wars, but on the creative side, I like how they have someone on the producing side and someone on the creative side now. That's more of the directors of the sequel trilogy, that Kathleen's decision, since the directors believe the plot line of the original trilogy is what made the latter do well." Uh, I think I understand what you're saying on that last comment. I'm a little confused by the phrasing, but I think you're saying it was more her responsibility to hire the right people to make the sequels, but she did a pretty good job from the overall business side of Star Wars. And I don't think that can be disagreed with because of how successful the business side of Star Wars was for those first 6 years under Kathleen Kennedy. It was the most profitable it had ever been. Star Wars hadn't had a billion-dollar movie before then. I mean, obviously, 3 other movies came out before billion-dollar movies were even close to a thing, but even the prequels never reached $1 billion until we got the re-release of Phantom Menace. So, uh, it was it catapulted Star Wars into a popularity it hadn't seen since 2005, and that was a big win, obviously, for the franchise. Let's see.
I think the only thing I can add, like you said, is just let's see what happens with Mandalorian Grogu and the plans that come out of that, and Starfighter and plans that come out of that. Because if, let's say, they're both successes, and then we don't get any clarity in the direction for the Mandoverse and post sequels, I don't know if that necessarily falls on her directly, but I think people view it as her not properly transitioning Filoni and Lynwen to make a decision and be very clear about how these sub franchises are going to be handled moving forward, right? That's at the end of the day, that's where her being a producer and her being the president for so long has to be instilled in these guys from the start. Like, you have to be clear and direct. We cannot have the same issues like we had the 2020 investors panel where we were announcing Rangers of the New Republic because Chapek just wanted more names and Star Wars: The Droid Story. You have clear products here, and you have to be very clear on the direction for them, either if there's going to be something coming or not. I think that's also another thing to really point out. Like, once these two come out, I know she's really emphasizing we want more standalone stories like Andor and Rogue One to happen, and Solo for sure to some degree, but we also, as fans, and her as a now ex-president of Lucasfilm, know that we also like knowing at least a general game plan of what's coming next and then committing to it. Like, if we hear within like 2 months that they're officially greenlit Mandalorian Grogu 2, if we hear that there's a full trilogy coming out for Starfighter after like half a year, people will like commit to it. That's the thing. We want that commitment to happen, right? And sure, everyone's going to be like, we still have to wait till we see something from set and all that. And I think that's a very safe position to have these days with Lucasfilm. But if you commit to these films and whatever true continuation comes out of these two final projects for her, that'll help her legacy out, and that will really help set the stage for the beginning of Lynwen's and Dave's legacy as the co-running presidents of Lucasfilm.
Colton says, appreciate y'all. Haven't been able to catch as many streams as I'd like to as of late. Appreciate you, Colton. Thanks for joining us tonight. Glad you were able to make it. Then we have Critical Thinker who said, I'm not a fan at all of the Disney era of Star Wars, but I'm not going to blame all of that on Kathleen Kennedy, nor do I have any of the random burning hatred a lot of Disney haters have for her. On the plus side, I quite appreciate that she fought for Gilroy and gave us Andor. Ultimately, I don't know how much of the bad decisions in the Disney era were the result of Kathleen Kennedy or of Iger slash other higher ups restrictions. So I can't really say whether I like or dislike her decisions with Star Wars, aside from what they've confirmed directly, since I'm just not sure what decisions was up to who. So overall, just judging by the products themselves, Andor was high. The high point sequel trilogy was the nadir, and overall, Disney Star Wars has almost completely missed the mark for me. Well, thank you for your opinion. Yeah, I agree that with a lot of what you said there. I mean, again, we can only judge from the outside. I'm sure there are a million layers to this, to every decision made in Star Wars, and as we've seen from something like the Hunt for Ben Solo, you can have something that internally at Lucasfilm itself is beloved, well liked, and they want to get going on it. They've already started pre-production, and then it gets up to the higher ups, and they kill it, right? So I'm sure there were at least a couple other scenarios where that same thing happened, where they were excited about something and the higher ups killed it. So absolutely, we can't fully judge her because we don't know what happened. And I appreciate your level-headed response with that because that's how I'm sure both of us feel. But yes, we can only judge the era and what we saw and didn't see, and what we know happened and didn't happen, I guess. And I feel similarly to you, Critical Thinker. I don't think I have the same hatred of the sequels that you have, but I have the same disappointment that overall they didn't especially end the way I was hoping they would. So thanks for your comments on that one. K-pop Times says, been listening to you guys getting through my slow work days. Listen to your whole High Republic live stream. A win for Andor big time and Rebels. Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you're enjoying some of the streams. These are always long, so we appreciate when people go back and listen after the fact. So glad to have you back, K-pop Times. But yeah, Andor was definitely her biggest win, and Rebels is her like kind of silent win because it feels like she wasn't even CEO when that was made or president when that was made, but it was the first thing that came out in terms of film or TV under her. So it was that like forgot because it was so long ago. It's that forgotten kind of masterpiece from her on the animation side, and it's the only real elite show they made in animation at the time. Like I said earlier, I think animation for the most part was really consistently good besides a couple hiccups, obviously. Like Resistance wasn't horrible, but it's just not anything memorable. And I would say Tales of the Empire was their other hiccup in terms of the Tales of series. But pushing Star Wars into anime for the first time, expanding Star Wars animation audiences, giving us multiple Star Wars animated series. I would say the only thing that I wish she was able to accomplish and that they were able to accomplish at Lucasfilm under her tenure was just getting more animation going instead of just one thing a year or one thing every, 14 months. We could have more than one series going at a time. We can have Star Wars animation pushed out to other places. And that's where we'll also see with the Legacy of the Ninth Jedi whether anime is a huge hit for Star Wars, because I think it opens up so many doors for the franchise in the future to not just more anime, but other animation studios who have a pitch for a Star Wars show, who want to take on the burden of financially funding Star Wars and licensing the franchise. And if Ninth Jedi succeeds, maybe Disney will be a little bit more interested in licensing Star Wars out to other studios to make animated TV products that we can have multiple different Star Wars animations going on at the same time, because I think it's a huge market that we're not capitalizing on currently.
It's a shame that we're not getting official Star Wars anime. I know we're getting the Vision spin-offs, right? Of like Ninth Jedi and all that. It's a good start, but if we had like Luke's Jedi Academy or some sort of Ben Solo teenage years done through anime, it'd be just such an interesting thing to be like, this is, you know, for everybody, but like this is how Japanese fans can like jump into a Star Wars that they're more familiar with, right? That is a little bit more, at least the sequels as a whole. Yes, Japan has always had a relationship with Star Wars, but the sequels as a whole definitely are the Star Wars that people know about in a lot of parts of Asia. And having anime be a gateway to re-enter that world again would be so awesome, especially knowing that it's going to be directly relevant to the films and exploration of characters before the films and even possibly after the films. So that's something I'd love to see more of. But yeah, I mean, it's a good start. It's just a shame that it's almost like Lucasfilm is only taking these like half steps so far. They're not really committing to the full scale push towards having like, hey, we're having an anime canon series that is going to be fully invested in for like 2, 3 seasons at minimum.
K-pop Time says, "Hear me out, High Republic anime." I would love that. I would love any
Yes.
Star Wars anime. I think people box anime in obviously to one specific form, one specific style. There's so many different styles, so many different types of anime. We can do so many different things in anime with Star Wars, but also with American animation. We could do a cartoon Star Wars. We can do a 3D animated Star Wars. We can do so many things. Disney owns the two most famous and most successful animation studios of all time, and we haven't had a Star Wars animated movie since the 2008 Clone Wars. Like, I want Star Wars to get into animation more. We've seen Spider-Verse succeed in theaters as an animated project. We've seen something like Ninja Turtles have a really good animated movie come out. There are so many ways we can make great Star Wars content without it being live action. And if the same amount of commitment was given to Star Wars animation in the future. And I think we have a stronger chance of that with Filoni, who has a backbone in animation. His entire career was created in animation. Maybe we can finally push into some more fantastical, more creative, uh, different types of Star Wars storytelling that you might not want to risk in live action, but in animation. Let's see. So we have really want to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes or so because we've gone really long, but we appreciate all you guys being here. I think the last word we'll give is to Kevin Davis, and then you guys can keep sending in stuff. We'll, before, excuse me, I'll give Kevin the last word before we move on to summarizing the last couple stories that I wanted to talk about. And then we'll read any last couple things that you guys have to say, but we're going to run through this pretty quick to close it out right now. Kevin Davis says it depends on who Disney's next CEO is. If Dana Walden, then they're going to move forward with storytelling and will include everybody. Josh D'Amaro, he's going to try to please folks instead of shaking the table. Fan bases criticize everything. Didn't help the situation. Disney overreacted, pulled back on making new stories, but they didn't want to offend the audience. Yeah, well, I think that's pretty accurate overall, Kevin. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the Disney CEO front. I know that obviously Bob Iger's trying to transition out again, and Josh D'Amaro has been the heavy favorite, but just as Chapek was, being head of Parks, Parks is their most profitable and consistent business, so it makes the most sense to elevate somebody from Parks to CEO, but it didn't quite work this past time, so I think that will be the main strike against D'Amaro, but I've heard D'Amaro's a really nice guy and everybody really likes him, so we'll see, where that comes in. I don't know much about Dana Walden, but I have heard the name a couple times. But in regards to Disney, yeah, I mean, obviously it's the direction they want to take all their companies, like we just talked about with Hunt for Ben Solo. They ultimately have the power to greenlight something or kill something, whether Dave Filoni and Lynwen Brennan like it or don't like it. If Disney loves it and Dave Filoni hates it, they still have the power to say we're making it. And vice versa. If he loves something that they hate, they're going to say no, we're not making it. Right. So it's ultimately their decision, but they have pulled back definitely on pushing the boundaries lately, trying to just find that general audience again. And I don't think that's the wrong move currently. They were so many of 2023 was a disaster for them. They had so many misses from big franchises, really expensive movies. They're trying to find the audience and what they want again before pushing the boundaries. And I think that's a sound approach to rediscovering, what it means to be theatrical post COVID, because everybody's still trying to figure it out, even 4 or 5 years after restrictions have all pretty much lifted. So uh, it's there's no, I guess, correct way to do it, no full template yet for how to do it, but we'll see if their current strategy works out ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, we'll know a direction in general for Disney with all its franchises sometime next month. That's the rumor, but can't really comment on that. That's, at least with Star Wars, we know a little bit more. It's a little bit more directly tied to us, engaging with the content, hearing about the trades and all that. The CEO game is it's battles that are we don't even know about that they're using in media against each other. I'm sure we are too with studio heads and all, but it's a different level. It's so hard, and especially with Disney and its infamous lineage of having a great CEO for a couple years and a terrible CEO for a couple years. It's not something that's like just Iger and Chapek. It's from the '90s and the '80s too. It's like it's just a thing that we'll have to see how it pans out. Honestly, this is a weird situation having Iger come back. I believe it's the first for a Disney CEO to do that. So whoever takes the lead and whoever is in charge next, yeah, they're gonna be in a different boat than usual. But who knows how different things will truly be?
Yeah, Disney hasn't had very many CEOs. They were all in the family for a while. It was Walt, obviously, then it was his brother Roy, then it was their I believe Walt's son-in-law who was running the company before it switched over to Michael Eisner. And then it was Michael
Yeah,
Eisner for 20 years, and then it was Bob Iger for over 20 years. So it's been a pretty consistent ship. So we'll see. The JPEG reign is the one outlier, and
yeah.
so we'll see what they ultimately do. But I think they would like to get it back to having somebody there for 20 plus years. But that's going to wrap up that portion. I think let's run through these last stories again really quick. I'm going to wrap this up here in a few minutes. But just so you all know what the other things that happened in the last few days were, Maul Shadow Lord. If you missed it on social media, they dropped a little tease to the teaser. Tomorrow we will be getting a trailer. Hopefully that also means we finally find out when the show is coming out. My theory for a long time has been May 4th. We'll see if I'm right or if it comes out earlier. I think it bodes well for it coming out earlier than that, since they are giving us a little trailer here on the 22nd of January. But who knows? We got our leaked trailer for it almost a year ago in April of 2025. So I would have thought this trailer would have been out far sooner. So that is coming out tomorrow. So keep your eyes out for that. Again, we will be doing a trailer reaction for it tomorrow. We also had reports that Rick Famuyiwa was developing a Star Wars series. This actually didn't come out of Kathleen Kennedy's interview. It came out shortly after from the wrap. But Rick Famuyiwa was developing a Star Wars series around 2021, 2022, that time. It ultimately fell through, and he was assigned, obviously, to be executive producer of Mandalorian season 3, and then also directed some episodes of that season and Ahsoka. His series is described as in limbo, which probably means it's not happening. Um, Interestingly enough, it's not. It sounds like it wasn't Rangers of the New Republic specifically. So if it wasn't that, they had another series that we can probably assume was related to the New Republic, because all his involvement with Star Wars so far has been in Mandalorian, Boba Fett, or Ahsoka. So that New Republic era. So I'd imagine it was in that time period, but it is currently in limbo. And considering Kathleen Kennedy didn't mention it at all, I feel like that one's probably pretty much done. And the final big piece of news, if you're a Disney Parks fan talking about Disney and their succession, we had some huge news around Galaxy's Edge. Galaxy's Edge came out in 2019. It launched. Rise of the Resistance didn't end up launching until 2020 here in California, but it did launch at the end of 2019 in Florida. Since then, almost nothing has been done with Galaxy's Edge. It's stayed pretty much the same. A lot of the promises they had early on never came to pass, like a lot of the LARPing elements, the actors that would walk around as different species, the different robotics. and like R2 units you'd see rolling around, or actors dressed up as protocol droids or other types of droids. They promised all of that it would be a living, breathing planet. It never happened. They also promised 3 missions for Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run. We only got 1. We are finally getting our second one this year, themed to the Mandalorian. But over the years, we have seen them start to tear down part of the canon around the land. Originally, the land was supposed to take place between episodes 8 and 9. That's when Smuggler's Run and Rise of the Resistance, which are both canon rides in the Star Wars continuity, take place. But in the last 5 years or so, we've seen them slowly strip how closely they want to keep the canon around it. They first put the Mandalorian in, then they added Ahsoka and Boba Fett to the land to walk around, which obviously clashes with the sequel elements that they had set up, the between 8 and 9 sequel elements. And then the big change was last year they soft launched Luke Skywalker for about a month, just around May, to celebrate Star Wars month slash Star Wars Day, and Luke walked around with R2, and it was pretty popular. Well, they have confirmed now that Darth Vader is coming and will be replacing Kylo Ren. If you've been to Disneyland or Disney World, you know that Kylo Ren has this whole pre-show with his shuttle where he walks down and he interacts with guests and there's stormtroopers, and then he walks around the land for about 20 minutes interacting with different guests and having funny conversations with them. They are fully replacing that now with Darth Vader and some stormtroopers. They haven't quite said if they're going to actually retheme the area. I would imagine they at least do some minor rethemes, like taking down some of the First Order flags and putting up Imperial flags. But I think the retheming of the shuttle to an Imperial shuttle will probably take a little longer, and they haven't announced yet if they are going to do that. We'll see. But it basically marks the end of the full immersion of sequel only elements of the land. It's going to be very mixed now. They also announced you can meet Han and Leia for the first time ever in front of the Millennium Falcon and take pictures with them, as well as Chewbacca. So things are really changing. From the changes, we got the announcement of the Echoes of the Empire Galaxy's Edge comic miniseries, which is supposedly going to explain why our original trilogy characters are there. I appreciate the effort to keep up, some semblance of a canon or something, but it ultimately doesn't matter. I think when this was announced, when Galaxy's Edge was announced, we had all hoped it was going to be like a Star Wars land to celebrate all Star Wars. And then when they announced it was going to be sequel only, which at the time sequels didn't exist yet, so we were all hopeful for. They announced it was going to be sequel only, but they announced it was going to have this whole like kind of LARPing element. It was actually going to be very immersive, and they were going to, you were really going to feel why it was sequel only. But since they never gave us any of that, I think a lot of fans, including myself, have just kind of missed that pure Star Wars energy that seeing a Han Solo or a Chewbacca and Darth Vader walking around would give the land. And so I'm really excited they're doing this. I hope they bring prequel characters to this at some point. I mean, obviously, it makes more sense to go OT. I've always argued that OT is the core and the heart of Star Wars, so it makes the most sense to go with those characters. And also, you have the Millennium Falcon there, so like that invokes OT. But they are saying the Mandalorian characters will stay in the bazaar area, the market area, shops. The sequel characters will stay near Rise of the Resistance, and all the original trilogy characters will roam everywhere else. So one day, hopefully, we'll see some prequel characters. I know Thrawn and Anakin both went there at one point in the prequels. But yeah, so I mean, this is exciting change. I think they're really going to go all in on Galaxy's Edge here to counterbalance what they're doing with Avengers Campus. Right now, they're building a huge ride over there. It's going to be really popular over in California Adventure. They're going to need something at some point to bring people back to Disneyland and make people excited for Disneyland. I would be shocked if we don't get the announcement of some more big changes and possibly another ride coming to Galaxy's Edge here in the next few years. And I think it would be next year because of the 50th anniversary. And then Disney's 75th is going to be 2030. So I think they're going to march towards that. But yeah, that's the information we have around Galaxy's Edge, Rick Famuyiwa's show, and Maul Shadow Lord. Sonic, I'll give you the final thought here on that, and then we're going to wrap up the stream tonight.
Yeah, I'll give my final thoughts, and then I think Batusai, you just sent a super chat, so we'll hit that, and then we'll close out our stream here. Um, I'm very pleased with the Darth Maul Shadow Lord tease. Visually very dynamic. I'm very surprised that for a tease they'd put this much effort into it. So I'm very curious how stylistic this trailer is going to be. I thought we were going to get more of like a standard Bad Batch, Clone Wars Rebels S trailer, but maybe there's more to it. And we know that one of the lead writers for forget his name, but he wrote for the Umbara arc in Clone Wars. So very excited for what that influence is going to look like. Obviously, Brad Rao is going to be back too. I think this is going to be the next evolution of our animation shows for sure. I think Bad Batch, we both really liked it, but it didn't necessarily become that Clone Rebellion show we're looking for. Maul Shadow Lord, it's got this weird, unique position where we know the ending of Maul as a character. So what is this really going to entail other than like leading us into more Crimson Dawn and things that are going to happen with Maul before he gets trapped on Malachor? But yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. I think this show has so much possibility and to explore it within its darkness. And I think going for like this very unique visual for the tease before even the trailer already speaks to their confidence about what they're doing here. So very excited about that. Famuyiwa, I know there was that other show, Ghost Track 19 or something, that was rumored to be development. I don't know if it was necessarily with him. It could have been Rangers, right? Maybe it wasn't because there was all this rumors about Gina Carano's character, which wow, I'm forgetting her name, or the character's name. It's been so long since she was in that, but um, supposedly she was going to lead some sort of show, and it wasn't necessarily a Rangers of the New Republic. Maybe that was the show that he was working on. Maybe it's not entirely on him, more so just what we're doing with Cara Dune is also out of the question, right? Um, and maybe it's hard to rework it around stuff like that. I know there's rumors about like getting Janita Gavankar for Iden Versio back or something like that. But yeah, I think I wouldn't mind another show with more auxiliary characters that can be more like background and supporting characters in these other shows and give the like people a chance to be like, oh, it's not like a big show, but it like connects us to all the other things that are happening between all these major flashpoints in Mandalorian and Boba Fett and Ahsoka. So I wish we had it, but it doesn't seem like that's gonna be happening. Seems like it's gonna be just integrated into the movies and TV shows moving forward. And Galaxy's Edge, yeah, I mean, uh, we're gonna see how it's gonna play out. I think it's not gonna necessarily be the original trilogy. It's gonna be technically early New Republic because we're gonna get Luke Han and the Echoes of the Empire art has him in the Return of the Jedi getup. I really doubt in between the events of Return of the Jedi they had time to go to Batuu. So I'm assuming this is like maybe a year or so after Echoes of Empire. It definitely implies very, very early New Republic era. And I think this is a way to like allow them to still be in that timeline where you have obviously the second mission come to the Smuggler's Run that is going to be Mandalorian Grogu focused. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what allows Ahsoka and all these other characters to more naturally integrate and walk around with each other. I'm very interested how the marketplace is going to change. If Kylo Ren's not going to have that, as someone mentioned, his collector car of the Imperial shuttle, and it's going to the Imperial tie variant that now Vader is going to be using at the parks. I'm very curious what he's going to have, if he's just going to be marching around the marketplace, if they're going to add some specific decor that was in the general area around the Millennium Falcon that's not going to be pulled or readapted to the marketplace. I wonder how the BX droids are going to be used. Maybe are we going to see them more specifically around Smuggler's Run because they're going to be, I believe, in Mandalorian Grogu. I think that's the rumor of that happening there. So very curious about the changes happening. Like you said, I want that prequel edition. I think once Thrawn gets really more established in live action movies and TV shows, we'll be able to maybe see Anakin, Padme, and Thrawn and have a little bit of that Thrawn alliances corner, but hopefully allow for like a Hondo and all these other characters who have been in like the Ethan Sachs comics to start appearing a little bit more actively around the park. But I assume at some point it'll be three eras. I don't know how the physical limitations of the area of the park are going to be like moving forward. I don't think this is like a Mario Land situation at Universal where it's so tiny that they have to like work every little space. I think there's a way to expand it a little further, but I assume that's going to be more so once we're well into the New Republic era, kind of closing out around Mandalorian, and then the post-sequel era with Starfighter and whatever else comes is like in truly full flight before we hear any announcements. So good first real step towards it. But I hope that it's less like feeling like, oh, this is specifically um, original trilogy, and more so like, hey, this now is a land that has some original trilogy parts to it, but we're still gonna have Luke and Leia feel like early New Republic during the joyous, victorious days right afterwards. So it'll be cool to see how it plays out there. But yeah, I'm excited nonetheless to see Vader and everyone else at the park more full time.
Yeah, me too. I really think that's going to bring a lot more life to it. I think it'll just bring a lot of more excitement around the Star Wars isms of the land rather than just like great rides and good
Right.
food. Like I think that's what it's turned into is people go there because of the how impressive the rides are and how good the food has been, but not necessarily to interact with the Star Wars elements. So hopefully that'll bring a little bit of that back. I did because I'm a Disney Parks fan. Like I really love Disney Parks. I did do the like deep dive a couple days ago, and they announced this and looked at the map. And they have a little bit of extra space back there. They could build at least one more ride if they wanted to. They also have Disneyland Forward coming, which will build an entire new expansion to Disneyland. It would probably not connect to Galaxy's Edge, but if you wanted to build a second Star Wars style land, you could do that there. All right, Baddest Size Super Chat. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and then we will be off unless we get any more Super Chats. Baddest Size says, great work, guys. How do you explain the concepts of free will and destiny within the Star Wars canon lore? Anakin chose, or was he destined? Wills go wild. I mean, what a heavy question to end the stream on. But I mean, I think in a lot of ways, we'd explain it similarly to how, you know, a lot of us would explain the concepts in a lot of religious practices in modern or in today's world. Like I would say I think Anakin is has free will. He can make decisions that are better for himself, and he does recognize his mistakes. He doesn't, maybe at one point he blames it on the Force, but it really feels like he blames it on Palpatine and he blames it on Obi-Wan and he blames it on the different people around him until by Return of the Jedi he's able to actually accept the blame on himself for his decisions. So I think he fully has the concept of free will. I just think with Anakin's power, the emotions that are in him because of his connection to the Force, his high attunement to emotion, that I think is accentuated via his strong midichlorian count and his high connection to the people around him. He's able to be manipulated maybe more so than other people of a lesser attunement to the Force. Anakin really feels things. He feels everything, and in every depiction of him, whether it's the more stoic, more Episode 2 Hayden Christensen depiction and the original kind of Clone Wars multimedia stuff, or it's the more happy-go-lucky Matt Lanter version that bleeds into the version you see at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. Anakin cares so much about the things and the people around him that I think ultimately that's his fatal flaw more so than being destined to fall. It's the things around him that he wants, because of his power, he wants to control everything so much. And he's so attuned to when it doesn't go right for him that ultimately he falls. So I think you could give the Force maybe a little bit of the reason why he is more takes the failures a little bit more on his shoulders, feels that weight, but I don't think it controls any of his actual decisions. He makes those decisions for himself and he has to live with the consequences. But I think the Force allows him opportunities to make the right decision. And ultimately, he makes the wrong ones until he's able to atone for what his wrong decisions were and save his son and make the correct decision in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I generally like that interpretation for me, free will and destiny in Anakin's case here is that I find destiny, at least when we center around Anakin and the whole chosen one thing, is that frequently characters say it could be misread, right? But I think misreading it is also too broad of a thing to look at. Sometimes I think ultimately, yes, he is gonna, defeat the Sith and bring balance to the Force, and he achieves that. But I think destiny is like a very narrow, simplistic way of looking at things, right? As free will comes into play in how he responds to things, how he engages with the world around him. And destiny does not account for the dogma of the Jedi. Destiny does not account for Palpatine and Plagueis and their manipulations of midichlorians and trying to chase down and find Anakin. Anakin stumbled on their way. It's not necessarily like something that was like, "Oh, okay," like he was specifically destined to run into Palpatine. Things just happened, and Palpatine maximizes opportunities, right? And maximizes influence. Treated this kid as like his little protege in a way that the Jedi never truly let him be, right? The Jedi were always saying, like, no, you can't be like this. You can't talk to your mother. We can't help you out there and alleviate some of your burdens, right? And why would they, right? Why would they necessarily make him be a special case if he's supposed to be like everybody else and be trained the same way as everybody else? If he's supposed to be representative of the Jedi, he should be treated like every other Jedi, right? So for me, when I look at his destiny, misread or not, it is a pretty simple thing. It's just that everything around it kind of comes down to just the stakes of the galaxy, the things that are already in play. Palpatine can't control every single element, but he sure did manipulate a lot of it to fall amongst one of his many plans. And he definitely skewed a lot of it so that Anakin and his concepts of free will were always going to be more negative and more embracing his powers, his abilities, and necessarily understanding there are things that maybe I can change and do if I'm patient with the Jedi, things that I need to more properly explain myself about. I mean, you can even look at like Padme. Padme was not necessarily part of his destiny, right? He just happened to be part of caught up in this whole mission of saving her, right? I Qui-Gon could have landed anybody else. Technically, Geonosis is in the same area in the same solar system as Tatooine. He could have landed there, right? Like you can say it's destiny, but in my mind, it's just that a couple of things came together and the free will was just maximized by people like Palpatine, and then Anakin got completely skewed on what believing what his free will was versus what his destiny was. The whole point for him was that he thought destiny meant that he had control of everything versus the fact that Palpatine understood that he could manipulate this kid from a very early age to believe in something that is such a simplistic line, right? That even if it is ultimately true, there's thousands and thousands of factors and millions and billions of trillions of creatures in the galaxy can shape and affect Anakin, and he can have the same effect on. So yeah, I don't think it's a matter if he was chosen or destined. I think he was a chosen one. I think that destiny was in place for that to happen. How it had to happen though, anything could have been there, right? If Palpatine's not in the question, he could have still very easily gone to the dark side if he'd run in sort of cult. If maybe Qui-Gon went a little too far in, like, free will teaching of the Force and stuff. It's not necessarily just everything had to be exactly how it happened. It just so happened to be that way because of a master manipulator, and Anakin believing more of that than, the people who actually loved and cared for him despite all the dogma. So, that's how I
Well,
look at it.
Well, that's going to wrap up our supersized episode. Hopefully, we made up for yesterday to you all. Thanks for watching. Thank you for those of you who have been here with us for the whole 2 hours and 40 minutes. We really appreciate you guys. Appreciate all of you for joining us. So, thank you so much. Next week, we'll be back on Tuesday. That's the plan. So, make sure you join us on Tuesday, 7 p.m. Pacific time. We'll be live. Bring your questions, anything that didn't get answered tonight, anything you asked the other day that didn't get on the stream tonight, anything you would like to talk about, bring those for our stream on Tuesday. Keep an eye out. We will have a trailer reaction tomorrow for Maul Shadow Lord. So hopefully you guys are excited for that and that trailer. Thank you so much for watching the stream tonight, everybody. Make sure you hit the like button if you haven't. Subscribe for more content and comment below if you're watching on replay. Thanks for watching, and we will see you all